The ultimate ideal is also the ultimate judge, because the ultimate ideal is something against which you always fall far short. That might be so painful that you can barely stand it, but then what you usually do is two things. You lower the ideal, and you raise your estimation of your own potential. What do I mean by lowering the ideal? Well, if you're comparing yourself to someone else, or even to a version of your future self, and the gap between where you are and where they are feels so painful that it paralyzes you, then you've created a dragon you don't have the tools to master. So what you need to do is scale that dragon down to size. You want to make the dragon small enough that you're at least willing to start moving toward it, however tiny that step may be. If you're here and your ideal is way up here, and that gap feels unbearable, then you reduce the gap. You make it closer, step by step. And you'll have to do that anyway because you're not going to leap from where you are to perfection in one single move. Progress happens incrementally, and you need to fill in that whole hierarchy of progression with a detailed enough vision that you can actually start moving forward. There's also something from the Gospels called the Matthew principle that fits here. It says, "To those who have everything, more will be given, and from those who have nothing, everything will be taken." It's brutal, but it reflects how reality often works. When you're moving upward, things accelerate upward in a way that feels exponential, like compound interest. But when you're moving downward, the decline isn't steady, it's a cliff, it's a steep fall. That's why you want to avoid the downhill path at all costs. And here's the good news. Because upward progress is exponential, it doesn't really matter how small your first steps are. Even if they're trivial, even if they're so small that you're embarrassed by them, the act of moving forward, if done with discipline, can speed up extraordinarily quickly. That means even if you feel useless, your efforts compound, and soon you're gaining momentum far beyond what you imagined. This is a critical thing to know, because it takes the sting out of realizing just how weak or foolish you might feel at the beginning. Everybody has their weak spots, things they're ashamed of, things they're embarrassed by. For me, when I first started going to the gym, it was 1985. I was 23 years old, 6'1", and I weighed only 135 pounds. I was very thin, waist about 27 inches. I smoked heavily, I drank too much, and I wasn't in good shape. My very first attempt at fitness was signing up for a swim size class. And there I was, me, a really overweight young guy about my age, and 7 women over 70. And those women could outswim me. It was humiliating. But I stuck with it for a semester, got a little better, and then I started weight training. That was rough too. I'd be under the bench press struggling to lift 75 pounds, and some big muscular guy would come over and tell me how to do it properly. Embarrassing. That's why so many people avoid the gym, because they're ashamed of how they look or how weak they are. But the reality is, you always start at the bottom. You start where you're weakest. And if you want to fix what's weak, you first have to admit that you're weak, and then accept that those first steps are going to be painful. For me, it took about 3 years to quit smoking. Then I quit drinking. And in about 3.5 years, I gained 40 pounds of muscle. I basically had to stop after that because I was eating 6 meals a day and it was insane. But I got a lot more physically confident and a lot more coordinated, especially from dumbbell work, which strengthens all the little tendons and ligaments. My lower body got more coordinated. I could dance better. And that even helped me socially because I was going out dancing a lot during school. The point of all this is, to strengthen what is weak in you, you must first admit your insufficiency, even to your own shame. People start out naive. And naive people often look optimistic, but they're not truly optimistic. They're just naive. They don't realize there's malevolence in the world. They don't realize there's malevolence in their own hearts. They're sheltered and dependent. And when that illusion breaks, it often shatters into cynicism. Now, cynicism is an improvement over naivety. At least the veil has fallen from your eyes. But the problem with cynicism, especially when it's mixed with arrogance, is that you can stop there, and that's a huge mistake. So the real question becomes, once you've been hurt by life, once you're no longer naive, and once your optimism is gone, how do you restore it without slipping back into blindness? You can't return to naivety. You can't unsee what you've seen. So the answer is, you replace naivety with courage. You rebuild optimism, not as blind hope, but as a moral imperative. Think about it this way. The future is guaranteed to be difficult. Personally, socially, globally, there are endless potential catastrophes. So the question isn't whether the future holds apocalypses, it does. The question is, what attitude do you bring to that? If you're naive, you're unprepared. If you're cynical, that's better, but it's still destructive. It's its own kind of hell, and it makes the likelihood of catastrophe even greater. The step beyond cynicism is wisdom, and wisdom isn't naive, it's courageous. Religious people have often failed to explain this well. Faith has been mocked as blind superstition by critics like Dawkins and the New Atheists. But real faith, in its deepest sense, is not superstition. It is the willingness to act out the proposition that you can ride the wave no matter how high it gets. And not only that, you can do it together with others, especially if it's done in goodwill. That attitude is the proper antidote to cynicism. Cynics, though, aren't cynical enough about their own cynicism. They question everything, but never their own doubt. But you have to ask, what makes you so smart? What makes you the judge of existence itself? Take the Collin kids, for example. They decided life itself was too cruel to sustain. So their solution was pure nihilism, raising a middle finger to man and to God. But here's the challenge. How does your cynicism excuse you from responsibility? How does it justify you in pursuing nothing but short-term pleasures? Why aren't you suspicious of your own doubt? That's where wisdom really begins, when you're cynical enough to question even the validity of your own resentment, your own bitterness, your own tendency to turn away from life. So, what's the right attitude toward the future? I would say it's the same attitude we should hold toward the past, present, and future alike. Gratitude. Gratitude is one of the primary religious rituals and one of the most grounding practices. Someone might object, "My life is terrible. What do I have to be grateful for?" But that objection, for all its pain, is still a kind of blindness. Even in extremely difficult circumstances, it's exactly in those conditions where gratitude matters most, because it forces you to dig deeper than your suffering, to find something worth affirming. It may be more difficult, but that does not mean it is inappropriate. There is a very tight connection between loving your enemy and being grateful despite the terrible things that occur in life. The story of Job in the Bible illustrates this powerfully. Job is a story of unjust suffering at its core. God himself declares Job a good man, so there is no ambiguity about his character. Yet all hell breaks loose, not because Job deserved it, but partly because God makes a wager with Satan. God essentially says, "Do your worst. Job will not turn against me." Then Job is struck down with illness, he loses everything he has, and his body is disfigured. His friends come and mock him, telling him he must be a wicked man to deserve such horrors. It is brutal. But Job refuses to lose faith in himself. He admits he is not perfect, but insists that as far as men go, he has done what he ought to do. His suffering is not punishment for sin, rather it is the tragic randomness of existence. He declares that he will not lose faith in himself no matter what. Even when his wife urges him to curse God, to shake his fist at the heavens and die, Job refuses. He maintains faith despite everything. That is the central moral of Job. One is morally obligated to maintain faith regardless of what happens. There is also a practical side to this. Imagine that God and Satan conspire against you. There will be times in life when it feels exactly like that. Now imagine that your response is to become bitter, resentful, and hostile. Whatever hell you were already in, caused by tragic events, you now open another, deeper hell beneath it. The hell of bitterness, resentment, ingratitude, and the quick slide into revenge. Things may be bad simply because they are bad. But if you let unjust suffering corrupt you, then you will discover just how much worse things can get. That is why this story offers some of the most practical advice possible. You are morally required to maintain faith, to aim upwards, and to treat others as you yourself would want to be treated, no matter what has happened to you. Now, it might be objected that this is impossible, that some people's lives are so brutal they are destined for corruption, but that is not true. Many people, particularly those encountered in clinical practice, have endured childhoods so dark and malevolent they are almost beyond comprehension. Yet, some of them still chose to aim upwards to keep faith in themselves and the world. That possibility is always on the table. In one of the early books, there was a chapter titled, "Compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is." This principle matters deeply. The only fair comparison is between who you are today and who you were yesterday. You are the only proper control group for yourself, because you alone have your unique talents, limitations, opportunities, tragedies, and possibilities. Comparing yourself to someone else is unreasonable, because you do not know their blessings, their opportunities, or their hidden suffering. It is far more constructive to ask whether you can be somewhat better in some dimension than you were yesterday. Almost always, the answer is yes. You may set a great goal as a target, but there is a distinction between aiming at something and comparing yourself to it. Often, comparison is a delusion. When jealousy arises, what people actually see is only a thin slice of someone else's life, the part that looks best, and often that slice has been carefully presented to look that way. You have no idea what horrors might lurk in the rest of that person's existence. Consider the example of someone who wishes to be like Russell Brand. What they truly want is all of Brand's charisma, fame, and success, but none of his problems. That is naive, resentful, jealous, bitter, and completely unreasonable. You cannot separate the good from the bad. They come together. Yet people rarely think of this when they envy the lives of others. The same principle applies to life planning and purpose. In the Future Authoring Program, for example, research shows that if students complete it, even badly, for just 90 minutes before entering college, their chances of dropping out in the first year decrease by 50%. This effect is strongest for those who are most at risk of failing. Most psychological interventions help high performers do even better, but here the weaker students benefit most. Why? Because high performers often already have a vision or a plan, while low performers are plagued by ambivalence and uncertainty. Without a plan, resistance wins easily. Doing nothing requires no effort. Doing something requires effort, sacrifice, and belief that the chosen path is better than all others. College, for example, demands getting up, attending classes, completing readings, writing exams, and believing this path has fundamental value compared to alternatives like idleness, distractions, or indulgence. Obstacles are many, and without reasons to overcome them, people falter. The Future Authoring Program helps in two crucial ways. First, it helps people construe themselves as the kind of person capable of creating a reason, forming a vision, and imposing it on the world. Second, it helps them actually develop that vision. There is even a biblical echo in this. Christ says in the Gospels, "Ask, and you shall receive. Knock, and the door shall be opened. Seek, and you shall find." At first, this sounds too easy, but it is not easy at all. It is exactly as hard as true wanting demands. To want something is to commit fully to seeking it. Think of the hero's quest. The Holy Grail, the treasure guarded by a dragon, the jewel hidden in the toad's head. The true seeker must be utterly committed, willing to sacrifice nearly everything of lesser value to reach the goal. Otherwise, he does not truly want, does not truly ask, does not truly seek, and does not truly knock at the door. This is the development of a vision. Consciousness itself can be understood as the implementer of vision in the broadest sense. What human beings truly confront is not a mechanical, deterministic world running like clockwork, pushed forward by the past in some algorithmic way. That is not how the world actually works. Instead, we are faced with a horizon of possibility, a reality that is somewhat predictable, like music that follows rules, but not predictable in a purely deterministic sense.
The world is filled with potential. That is its nature, possibility, and potential. To maximize the quality of our interaction with this potential, we must impose a vision upon it and then pursue that vision. That is the essence of what the Future Authoring Program attempts to achieve, the deliberate development of a vision.
The first exercise begins with a simple but profound premise. You get to have what you need and what you want. Perhaps even better, you get to have what you need and want if you were treating yourself properly. So imagine, first, that you were treating yourself properly, as if you genuinely cared about yourself. For many people, this is hard to do. We know our flaws so intimately that it is often difficult to extend care toward ourselves. So if you cannot imagine caring for yourself, you begin by imagining someone you love, and then apply that same attitude to yourself, with all your faults and inadequacies. It is not casual advice. It is hard work to genuinely do this. But imagine you should take care of yourself, that you could, and that you did. That opens the door at least to the possibility. The next step is to imagine yourself 5 years down the road. You are asked, if you could have what you need and want, if you were taking care of yourself, what would that look like? This is not a shallow question of, how can I be happy? Rather, it is a much deeper one. What justifies your suffering? Life will be difficult. It will inevitably be marked by suffering, tragedy, disappointment, betrayal, and catastrophe. That is certain. So the question is, given that burden, what would make life worth carrying? What would make it meaningful enough to justify its suffering? This is the deep question posed in the exercise. You are asked to write for 15 minutes about what your life could be like in 5 years if you had what you truly needed and wanted. Students and clients often say, I don't know what to do with my life. But that is not a very good question. Life is everything. You cannot expect a one-line answer to cover everything. A better approach is to particularize what a desirable future looks like by examining the places where human beings typically find meaning. If someone comes in depressed, the first step is to distinguish, are they clinically depressed or do they simply have a terrible life, or perhaps both? That is an important distinction. If you are depressed despite having a reasonably good life, that is one problem. But if you have a terrible life, that is another problem entirely. So what constitutes a good life? There are common domains of meaning. People usually find meaning in an intimate relationship, or at least in the belief that such a relationship is possible. They have friends, real friends. They're connected to a family, whether children, parents, siblings, or grandchildren, and those family relationships are positive. They have a job or a career that, even if difficult, is socially productive, provides income, and involves decent relationships with coworkers. They're educated to the level of their capability, or at least have a plan for furthering their education. They care for themselves mentally and physically. They have strategies for dealing with temptations, drugs, alcohol, misused sexuality. And ideally, they also adopt a degree of civic responsibility, participating in the community beyond themselves. If a person has none of these, life will feel meaningless. Without sustaining structures of meaning, life collapses into tragedy, and the natural consequence is misery. This is why the Future Authoring Program asks participants to examine these 8 domains carefully. You are told you can have what you want, but you must aim at it. To sin means to miss the mark, to miss the target, and it is missing the target that takes you away from what is divine. The first step is to know that there is a target. Then, even if your aim is poor, you at least have something to aim at, and you can practice. So you ask, if you had an intimate relationship, what would it look like? If you had friends, how would you want those friendships to be conducted? If you had a job or career, what might it be? If you had what you wanted, how would your life take shape? Some people find it harder than others to structure their lives. One practical suggestion is to take a personality test, such as the one at understandmyself.com, to learn something about your traits. For example, if you are low in conscientiousness, making and sticking to a schedule will be particularly difficult. If you are high in negative emotion or neuroticism, you may worry so much about creating a schedule that you never actually implement it. The first step, then, is to clarify why you even want a schedule in the first place. What are the goals that motivate it? A schedule only makes sense when it is tied to meaningful goals. This is where the future authoring program at selfauthoring.com becomes crucial. It guides people through the difficult process of clarifying goals, making detailed plans for the future, and breaking those plans down into actionable steps. You cannot create an intelligent schedule without first having a plan, because the activities in your schedule should relate to goals that matter to you. There is also the present authoring program, which helps people identify their virtues and their faults. That way, your plan can include capitalizing on your strengths while working to correct your weaknesses. The entire process is designed to help you clarify what you want, break it into manageable steps, and then schedule those steps in a way that makes action possible. A proper schedule is not a prison. It is a structure that ensures your daily actions are connected to the long-term goals that give life meaning.
For example, consider a trivial task such as writing a report for school, something a person might not feel very capable of. The process could begin with simply visiting the library one day just to get familiar with the environment. On another day, the next step could be checking out a book. The following day, one could open that book and flip through it. Later, reading the first page might follow. If that seems too difficult, then even reading the first paragraph could be enough. The essential point is negotiation with oneself, determining the largest step toward the goal that one is actually willing to take. If that step feels too large and remains undone, the step must be made smaller and smaller until it becomes manageable. Another potential step is simply familiarizing oneself with scheduling tools such as Google Calendar. The first task could be nothing more than opening the application. The next step might involve learning how to insert a single task, followed by learning how to add a repeating task. One could start with very simple entries, such as listing the time to wake up or the time to go to bed. Meals could also be added, since they happen daily and are likely to be followed. Each of these small entries represents small but meaningful successes. The schedule can then be expanded gradually by inserting activities such as reading, exercising, or attending social events. Even something like watching a movie could be scheduled. The important shift is to see the schedule not as a tyrant imposing obligations, but as a friend that allows time for desired activities. By framing the schedule as a supportive structure rather than an external oppressor, it becomes an ally. It provides accountability without becoming a punishing force. This reframing transforms the schedule into a tool for personal fulfillment rather than a source of resistance.
One of the most common roots of anxiety is the uncertainty of not knowing what to do. People often misinterpret this feeling as boredom, but in reality, it can create significant unease. A schedule eliminates that uncertainty by establishing a framework where decisions are already made in advance. This is why conscientious individuals tend to experience less negative emotion. By structuring their environment, they reduce unpredictability, which in turn lowers anxiety. Designing a life around valued goals, supported by a practical schedule, not only provides clarity, but also delivers satisfaction and relief. The process does not require perfection from the start. One could begin with broad strokes, scheduling only a few simple, highly likely tasks. Over time, details can be filled in as confidence and familiarity increase. Almost everyone who has achieved notable accomplishments has learned to structure their time deliberately. While highly entrepreneurial individuals with lower conscientiousness may resist this kind of structure, most eventually benefit from it. Personality traits also influence how one might approach scheduling. For instance,
Someone agreeable but low in conscientiousness may struggle with routines but will remain motivated if the schedule involves helping others. An extroverted individual could schedule regular social events. An introverted person may schedule solitary walks or time for reflection. Someone high in openness could include creative pursuits in their calendar. By aligning scheduled activities with personal temperament, the likelihood of maintaining the routine increases.
Struggling with self-discipline is common. Even conscientious people find it difficult at times. Developing discipline is like training a cart horse to pull a heavy load. It takes time and incremental effort. The process begins with small, enjoyable actions and progresses toward more difficult but necessary tasks. Through consistent practice, discipline is cultivated gradually, and incremental improvements sustained over time can lead to profound transformation. Another common issue encountered in clinical psychology is a lack of assertiveness. Those who are too agreeable, overly compassionate and polite, often allow others to walk over them. This leads to resentment, bitterness, and even manipulative behavior. True goodness does not mean doing everything for everyone else at the cost of one's own well-being. Instead, it means engaging in reciprocal relationships where both parties benefit. When one constantly sacrifices themselves without setting limits, resentment inevitably builds. And resentment is among the most toxic emotional states, capable of corroding one's entire outlook on life. Resentment often arises from the recognition that life is brutally difficult, sometimes unbearably so. While this acknowledgement is valid, the danger lies in allowing hardship to turn into demoralization, cynicism, and withdrawal. Such a response represents a profound failure, making everything worse. The only true answer to life's inevitable suffering and catastrophe is to respond with resilience and responsibility. As illustrated in cultural examples such as Rocky's speech to his son, the message is clear. However terrible circumstances may be, retreating into bitterness and despair is never the solution. The central message drawn from Rocky's speech to his son emphasizes the harsh truth of life. The world is not all sunshine and rainbows. Life is brutal, unforgiving, and often unfair. Challenges will come without warning, and suffering is guaranteed. The key point Rocky makes is that what defines a person is not how hard they can hit, but how hard they can get hit and keep moving forward. Strength is found in endurance, resilience, and the refusal to collapse under pressure. Blaming others for one's failures may provide temporary relief, but it ultimately traps a person in weakness. Rocky's message highlights the destructive path of pointing fingers at external circumstances, parents, society, or fate. Taking responsibility is the only path to strength. Accepting personal accountability, even when life seems unfair, creates the foundation for growth. This transformation weakness into resilience and despair into determination. Falling into a victim mentality may feel justified because life is undeniably tragic. Yet the danger of this mindset lies in its corrosive effect. It breeds bitterness, cynicism, and cowardice. Those who embrace victimhood often withdraw from the world, convincing themselves they are powerless. But powerlessness is an illusion. Each step toward responsibility, no matter how small, reclaims a measure of strength. The refusal to live as a victim becomes the first act of resistance against life's inherent suffering. Resilience does not arise all at once. It is built gradually through facing one small challenge after another. Every time a person takes a step forward, even if it is tiny, they develop a stronger capacity to withstand hardship. Just as muscles grow under stress, character strengthens under the weight of responsibility. Transformation is not the product of sudden revolution, but of steady, incremental improvement sustained over time. Responsibility is not merely a burden, it is the very thing that justifies life's suffering. By carrying responsibility willingly,
one transforms despair into meaning. Life remains difficult, but that difficulty is redeemed by purpose. This is the antidote to resentment. Instead of collapsing into bitterness, responsibility provides a structure where suffering becomes part of a greater journey. It does not erase hardship, but gives it a reason.
The recognition begins with the admission that life is brutally difficult, sometimes unbearably so. This reality cannot be ignored. It is visible even in cultural movements that emphasize victimization, a warped reflection of life's inherent tragedy. It is better to confront this directly. Misery exists, and often for deep, undeniable reasons. Yet if a person allows that misery to demoralize them, turning into bitterness, cynicism, cowardice, and withdrawal, then that becomes the highest form of failure. Such a response only makes everything worse. The question then arises: how should one respond to catastrophe and challenge? The answer, as Rocky tells his son in no uncertain terms, is that terrible as things are, the essential act is to endure. It is not about avoiding hardship, because hardship is inevitable. It is about facing the blows of life and still moving forward. There is far more potential within a person than they can possibly imagine. If they face challenges directly with faith and courage, they can embark on the adventure of their life and prevail, even over catastrophe. Modern computational power provides both advantages and disadvantages. On one hand, everything is available at one's fingertips. On the other hand, everything is also in one's face. This may take the form of 40 million pornographic images or an endless array of tragic scenarios, truly endless. The fundamental problem then arises: how does one handle the fire hose of information? No one fully knows the answer. It is little wonder that young people today are demoralized and anxious, because nearly everything is structured to demoralize them and intensify their anxiety. On the masculine front, young boys are told repeatedly that the world is nothing but a terrible patriarchal tyranny. They are told that history itself is nothing more than an endless chain of oppression, exploitation, and planetary destruction. From this perspective, any manifestation of masculine impulse becomes equivalent to a world-destroying force. Yet to stand up for oneself, one must have clearly defined goals and vision matched with a coherent strategy. Without this, resentment remains vague, inarticulate, and corrosive. If a person cannot articulate what they want, they cannot negotiate for it. It is necessary to establish both a vision and a counter-vision. The counter-vision involves recognizing the kind of personal hell that awaits if one remains too agreeable and avoids standing up for oneself. Such a life could mean constantly being taken advantage of, leading to deep bitterness and resentment, a form of hell not worth inhabiting. Agreeableness may serve women well in caring for infants, but it is not a strong temperamental strategy in complex adult organizations. Women, therefore, must often overcome this tendency in order to assert themselves effectively in hierarchies of accomplishment. Once vision and countervision are established, resentment must be examined. Resentment usually has two possible roots. The first is immaturity, simply whining and feeling sorry for oneself, in which case the solution is to grow up. The second is the existence of a genuine need or truth that must be expressed. Distinguishing between these requires honest reflection and at times discussion with someone trustworthy. If the resentment is justified, then it is a signal that something must be said or acted upon. This requires a strategy for clear, compelling self-expression. Many people fail to obtain what they want because they never specify it, and they never ask for it.
When negotiating for a raise, promotion, or additional resources, it is not enough to hope to be noticed. Managers already overloaded seldom notice what is going well. They notice only what is going wrong. Therefore, one must make a clear and compelling case for why they deserve recognition or advancement. This requires a plan, a strategy, articulated arguments, and the courage to put them forward. It also requires remembering that one owes oneself as much as one owes others. Caring for oneself is a moral duty. Truth becomes an indispensable ally here. Even though it may seem harsh in the short term, truth remains the best friend. If dissatisfaction at work stems from exploitation, then one must strategize a way out of it. This often means overcoming a deep reluctance to enter into conflict. Negotiation and conflict are almost indistinguishable. Avoiding both may seem easier moment by moment, but in the medium and long term, the price is severe. It is better to face the conflict now, directly and courageously, and secure peace later. Happiness cannot be the ultimate purpose of life. At best, it arises sometimes, but it inevitably fades during times of difficulty. What life can always be, however, is an adventure. Truth provides the greatest adventure. Speaking truthfully, even cautiously and responsibly, creates uncertainty. One cannot predict what will happen, and this unpredictability is the essence of adventure. Moreover, if the words are genuine, then the adventure belongs authentically to the speaker. If speech is manipulated, crafted for appearances, or dictated by the crowd, then the adventure is no longer one's own. This search for meaning is why people remain obsessed with fundamental purpose. Imagine two people laying bricks to build a massive wall. One sees only endless bricks, trivial effort, and wasted life. The other envisions a cathedral that will stand for 300 years. Though both perform the same task, the second experiences purpose because each brick becomes connected to a higher aim. The magnitude of the goal determines the magnitude of the reward for each small action. Aimlessness and fragmented goals destroy this sense of meaning. Without clear aims, no action brings reward. Without unified goals, no step feels like progress. The result is no positive emotion, no learning, and no hope.
Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to learn and adapt, improves when one is in a state of meaningful apprehension directed toward a valued goal. This means people learn best when motivated by something they truly want to understand. This principle applies even to writing. When writing an essay, the first and most important step is to identify a genuine question worth answering. Without it, the exercise becomes empty, dull, and futile. The nervous system itself resists falsehood, signaling boredom and frustration when one participates in meaningless work. But if the question genuinely grips the writer, then the act of writing becomes alive, an adventure in itself. The mystery becomes real, the process becomes meaningful, and learning accelerates. The dopaminergic system functions through anticipation, followed by action, then either reward or, in some cases, no reward. What matters most is the ability to persist toward a goal regardless of immediate outcome. This persistence is a generalizable system, one that extends far beyond a single task or pursuit. There is also the recognition that such persistence forms the foundation of resilience and growth. The chapter under discussion emphasizes that anticipation tied to meaningful goals not only fuels motivation, but also strengthens the capacity to continue even when the expected reward does not immediately appear.
Get your room in order. Put your belongings in order. This is deeply relevant right now. Even though it's important to have higher goals and lofty ambitions, the dopamine system plays a critical role here. It's an incredible system because it is depletable, yet at the same time, it's renewable, and it is also self-amplifying. What that means is this. Imagine someone doesn't really know what they are working toward. They don't have a specific big goal or question guiding them. By simply completing even small and seemingly menial tasks like making a cup of coffee, drinking it, cleaning the cup fully, drying it, and then putting it back in the cupboard, what happens is more than just tidying up. That seemingly trivial act becomes a real goal. In addition to making the kitchen look nicer, it completes a circuit, what you could call the dopaminergic circuit.
When dopamine is released, even if not in the same measure as writing and publishing a novel, but still to some extent, it amplifies our ability to think into the future, to imagine more plans, to make more moves, even ones not directly related to what you just did. And this dopamine boost literally increases both confidence and energy. Why? Because most of us think only about caloric energy, the food and fuel we take in. But what people are rarely taught, and if there were 10 things I could teach anyone, this would be one of them, is that adrenaline, or epinephrine, is neural energy. It's the spark that makes you jittery when you're nervous, but also the very same energy that pushes you to move forward, to go on a run, to pursue any goal, mental, physical, or otherwise. And here's the crucial point. Epinephrine, or adrenaline, is manufactured directly from dopamine. In the biochemical cascade, dopamine converts into adrenaline, which is the basis of all neural energy. That includes the energy of thinking itself. So, if someone is not yet in a place where they can set their sights on a lofty goal, a graduate degree, a novel, a business, the way to get there is by completing things in their immediate environment. Start something, finish it, and in doing so, you close that dopaminergic loop. At the very least, these are micro-narratives. They may not be integrated over a long span of time, but they are far from meaningless. In fact, they're essential. This was something I wrote about in my first book, Putting Your Life and Your House in Order. If you feel lost, one of the first things you can do is to look around and ask, what small direction can I take right now? You fix something nearby. I used to tell my clients this simple truth. Find something small you could do that would make things better, and then do it. There's humility in this, because when you're in a low-energy state, you may feel like you don't even have enough strength to cook dinner, but maybe you have just enough to put a fork on the table. Sometimes people are so depressed that this is truly all they can manage. But the point is, can you take one small step forward, even if it seems insignificant?
I knew that adrenaline came down the biochemical chain from dopamine, but I hadn't fully grasped the significance of it. The truth is that even implementing a micro-routine, such as washing a cup and returning it to the shelf, has power. It's meaningful because you've already decided cups belong on shelves. That's a chosen order of living. By carrying out that micro-goal, you complete the loop. That act gives you a kick of dopamine, which then transforms into adrenaline, and that energizes you further. This explains why it has an antidepressant effect. And with that extra push, you can lean into another behavior. Some of the more effective classes of antidepressants, though not for everyone, are precisely the ones that work through the dopaminergic and adrenergic pathways. That's different from SSRIs, which function on another system altogether. But this demonstrates how even on a neurochemical level, completing a trivial task like putting away a cup creates neuroplasticity in the short term. It gives you more dopamine, which gives you more adrenaline, which then tilts your state forward. If depression feels like being back on your heels, these small acts push you slightly forward, placing your center of mass ahead. From there, it depends on what you do next. The cognitive appraisal, how you interpret the act, becomes critical. The prefrontal cortex is central in deciding which loops get repeated. If you interpret these actions by telling yourself, I'm someone who can get things done, even if they're small, then you reinforce a powerful loop. And here's another cognitive frame. Small things are not actually small. That's precisely the point. Cleaning your room may appear trivial, but it's not obvious at all that this is the case. Putting your immediate surroundings in order is not a small accomplishment. In fact, it's often the necessary first step toward putting larger parts of your life in order. So those small actions are not as small as you think. They are a step forward, and forward is always a good direction, which means you can give yourself credit, especially when you're depressed. Instead of dismissing the act as trivial, you can recognize it for what it is, movement forward. In your metaphor, you've tilted your momentum. And if you keep doing that, you'll move out of retreat or paralysis. From there, who knows what you may eventually achieve.
If you don't yet know what to do with your life, if you're unsure of who you should become, the answer doesn't have to begin with a career decision. Sometimes people confuse identity with career.
But here's another way of thinking about it. An ethos taken from Navy SEAL culture that was detailed by Congressman Crenshaw. Here are some of the things you could choose to be. You will be someone who is never late. You will be someone who takes care of his people, gets to know them, and puts their needs above your own. You will be someone who does not quit when adversity strikes. You will be someone who steps up to lead when no one else will. You will be detail-oriented, vigilant, and attentive. You will be aggressive in your actions, but never lose your composure. You will have a sense of humor, because sometimes humor is the only thing that gets you through the darkest hours. You will work hard and perform even when nobody is watching. You will be creative, think outside the box, even if it gets you into trouble. You will be rebellious but not mutinous. You will be a jack of all trades, even if a master of none. Later, the description continues, be aggressive enough to kill the enemy, but immediately calm enough not to frighten a little old lady. Be someone mentally tough enough to function in horrific chaos and yet able to transition instantly to tranquility without mentally breaking. Be capable of shifting from a hyper-masculine aggressor to a gentle caretaker. Be both a warrior and a gentleman. And the truth is, the qualities that make SEAL leaders great are rarely physical in nature. They're psychological and moral. They listen, they empower their teams, they entrust people with responsibility carefully and deliberately. They highlight good performance publicly, and they criticize bad performance privately. This is a conservative ethos. These are lists of virtues. They are not the only possible lists, but if you feel lost and don't know where to begin, they are a strong place to start practicing. This ties back to an Aristotelian idea. We are our habits. We become what we repeatedly practice. So if you're lost, you can make a list of qualities you admire. Then you can start practicing them, even locally, even minimally, in your closest relationships. As you practice, you'll improve. And as you improve, you'll broaden your abilities, your scope of action, and eventually your influence on a wider scale. Throughout life, you will have people you look up to. Think about that phrase, look up. Why up? Because up implies distance, direction, and elevation. It's like a light on a hill, calling you forward. We automatically assume that those we admire are above us, ahead of us, toward a higher vision. This metaphor also implies struggle. It's easier to walk downhill than uphill. So to look up to someone means to recognize that growth requires climbing, effort, and striving towards something beyond where you stand now. You may have noticed that looking up also implies that there is some struggle required to reach that higher point, because it is always easier to go downhill than it is to go uphill. Yes, that's right, it's an uphill track. And it also implies judgment, because if someone is above you, they serve as a judge, or you judge yourself in relation to them. You compare yourself unfavorably, and that can inspire resentment or even the desire to tear them down. That is the story of Cain and Abel, a major story. Think about the way a teacher, parent, coworker, mentor, or friend interacts with others. You observe them, and you come away thinking that behavior works better. They are respected, admired, successful. And then you start to wonder why. If you are even a little humble instead of envious, you'll notice something important, because the envious thought is, that person's just a crook. They stole their position and that's why they're there. But if you're humble, you might think, no, that person looks successful. Maybe they know something I don't. When you look closely, what you are really noticing are attributes and character traits, qualities that are good and worth aspiring to. You're noticing the patterns that make some people more successful than others. You are seeing what a hero looks like. And in the process, you're discovering a pathway made up of desirable personality traits that help you climb upward in the social hierarchy. That is Jacob's ladder, by the way. The ladder itself is the hierarchy of the good. The vision Jacob had of the pathway to God was not just a dream, but a symbolic recognition that life is structured hierarchically. At the very pinnacle sits the ultimate good, the highest possible value, and along the way are intermediary structures and beings inhabiting those structures. This is not abstract metaphysics. If you admire someone, the reason you do so is because they are higher up in that heavenly hierarchy, so to speak, than you are. Your entire nervous system recognizes it. You are compelled to listen. You are compelled to pay attention. It is not a choice. It is the action of your unconscious mind drawing you toward that vision.
What's fascinating about this point of identifying heroes or role models, because you could use either word, though heroes may sound more compelling, is how pop culture actually plays a role in it. There are plenty of people who don't have good role models in their personal lives, and we have to acknowledge that. So where do they turn? Perhaps this is one reason cultural battles matter so much, and why they've become a serious part of our politics. It's necessary, but also deeply unfortunate. Still, it's undeniable that there has been a backlash to the progressive, victim-centered attack on culture. Think about the movie Top Gun: Maverick. It became one of the highest-grossing films of all time, and for good reason. It was phenomenal and fun to watch. Why? Because it infused classical virtues into the story. Relationships, responsibility, consequences for how you treat people. These timeless themes speak to people on a deep level. They may not articulate it, but they feel it when they see it. There are loud minorities who want to change that, who want something else to sit on that hill of values. But people resist because it isn't true, and something inside them cries out against it. That inner cry can be appealed to by a storyteller. You can see the same thing in the Marvel Avengers series. Those films were turned, in their own way, to a wide range of classical virtues: brotherhood, a military ethos, sacrifice, and striving upward. They also highlighted masculine virtues. Consider the combination of the Hulk and Iron Man, two radically different figures. The Hulk has a monstrous element, but he is also a strange kind of hero, and he becomes a revitalizing force for Iron Man at a critical moment. That's why those movies were not only attractive, but necessary. They filled a cultural void, a radical conceptual void. It is the same void that your book seeks to address with its appeal to duty, responsibility, and humor at the same time. That's a form of stoicism in the face of catastrophe. And catastrophe is inevitable. Imagine aiming for something and then discovering it's impossible. Or worse, realizing you were aiming in the wrong direction all along. What do you rely on men to set yourself straight? Certainly not the aim you've lost. What you must rely on is your ability to take new aim. And that ability is entirely dependent on your character. There is no more fundamental aim than what you should be. And there is no better way to describe what you should be than this. You should fortify.
Now the journey turns toward the promised land. That direction itself is inspiring because it generates positive emotion. Positive emotion arises when someone sees themselves moving toward a valued goal. Without a valued goal, there can be no positive emotion. That is exactly how the systems are set up psychophysiologically. On the other hand, there are the negative emotions, anger, bitterness, and fear, that may stop someone in their tracks. What can be done with those obstacles? One must take careful stock of their own sinful nature. Each person knows the temptations they are most vulnerable to, the weaknesses that knock them off the beaten path. Guilt often accompanies this awareness. A person understands the specific kind of hell they could inhabit if they allowed those weaknesses to take control. So why not write about that for 15 minutes? Not what could be achieved in 5 years, but the pit one could dig for themselves if they refused to move forward. Everyone has an instinctive sense of this.
For some, that temptation may be alcohol. It can calm in social situations, create a sense of kinship with others, and act as a stimulant. It is, in many ways, a very effective drug. But enjoyment can quickly become excess. The only way to stop was to find better things to do. In this case, better things meant writing the book Maps of Meaning while still in graduate school. Life was coming together, but the social lifestyle was still strong. Yet, it became clear that thinking was impossible with a hangover. More than that, the emotional weight of the intellectual work being done, facing historical atrocities and their motivations, was too dark and demanding to endure while hungover. Anxiety is heightened in that state, and clarity is diminished. Editing serious work requires extremely fine gradations of judgment. Impaired thinking does not improve work, it makes it worse. Another realization came from regret. Regret only seemed to appear after drinking. Alcohol disinhibits, which can be fun, but the next morning often brought the thought, I was too provocative, I was too aggressive, I was too mean-spirited in my wit, too egotistical, too careless in my choice of words, too uncontrolled in my social behavior. These realizations were compounded by the fact that, by that point, graduate student life included teaching and interacting with professors. In those environments, drunken behavior transformed not only the image, but the very reality of becoming a fool. Marriage and the decision to have children brought another decisive moment. The thought was simple: I will not drink when I have children. Growing up became necessary, and by then it was time to leave the old ways behind. This demonstrates the principle, imagine the hell you could inhabit. People are often afraid of moving forward, and rightly so, but one should be even more afraid of not moving forward. If hell is placed clearly behind, then the choice becomes sharper. One may think, I don't have the effort or the energy. I'm not sure if this is the right thing. But the real question becomes, do I want to go back there? The answer is clear: absolutely not. That fear can motivate far more powerfully than vague hope. Without feeling the reality of hell, motivation will never be as strong as it could be. Understanding just how dismal and dark things could become can provide immediate strength. That was the advantage of the future authoring exercise, not only imagining where life could go if it went well, but also envisioning exactly where one would end up if it went wrong.
Studying historical atrocity deepened this understanding. It raised a haunting question: do you want to end up bitter, resentful, and bent on harming others? Lies and deceit inevitably lead to destruction. Resentment and bitterness bring only more of the same. A person must ask themselves honestly, is that where I want to end up? For many people, uncertainty leaves them paralyzed. They simply do not know what to do. That is why programs of structured writing and self-authoring are so useful. They help in forming a concrete plan. Human beings are visionaries by nature. A plan, even a small one, provides direction. In personal experience, even 15 minutes of writing, dreaming about the future as if it were exactly what was most deeply desired, had real impact. Outlining those goals afterward brought a surprising result. The very things written down began to appear in life. It was shocking at first, but also deeply revealing. Human beings perceive the world through a goal-directed framework. When goals change, the world itself appears different. This can seem mystical, but in another sense, it is perfectly understandable. For example, looking in one direction might reveal a television and a couch. Looking in another reveals a person sitting in a chair.
What changes reality is not the objects themselves, but the orientation of attention. The same principle applies metaphysically. When someone changes the direction of their life, the reality that manifests before them also changes. If a person decides to be courageously trusting toward others, then when opportunities arise, instead of shrinking back in timidity or skepticism, they choose to step forward with faith. This deliberate choice to trust people when they extend an opportunity can reshape the course of life. It does not mean being naive or blind, but rather having the courage to meet the world with openness rather than fear. When someone changes their orientation, the world itself responds. By shifting the lens of trust and courage, opportunities appear where before there was only hesitation. New pathways open, not because reality itself has changed, but because the vision through which it is perceived has been transformed. That is the nature of goal setting, planning, and courageous faith in action. The world manifests differently to the one who dares to step forward. To be courageous and trusting means that when someone opens a door for you, you see it as an opportunity. You think, oh, that's a door I could walk through, instead of fearing that you're stepping into a trap. It's the same reality in some sense, but the way you choose to interact with it changes everything. It can change so radically that it barely feels like you're living in the same world. There are many valid interpretations you can place on the world, and some of them are deeply positive. What's remarkable is that those positive interpretations still work. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you could place a profoundly positive vision on reality in a strategic and calculating way, not in a manipulative or instrumental way, but because you're aiming at something genuinely good and then watch it work? That's how the world operates. One of the things I loved most about my clinical practice was this: the best parts of me and the best parts of my clients would work together to make their lives better. And it worked. For example, I had many female clients who tripled their income in 4 years. They didn't even think that was possible. They would say, I don't make enough money, I'm barely making ends meet, I'm a single mother, I have no idea what to do, I don't like my job. So we would make a plan. I would ask, what do you want? They'd answer, I'd like to make this much money. And then I'd say, why don't we double that? Just aim higher. Some people do make more money than that, so maybe it could be you. They would often reply, that's not even possible. But then we'd agreed to at least assume that maybe it could be possible and see what would need to happen. That meant working on their CVs, filling in the holes, then creating a plan, then practicing interviews until they weren't just competent at them, but until they were actually excited about them. Many clients who started in hopeless situations found themselves making rapid improvements in all areas of life. A few were in such desperate circumstances that the best I could do was help buffer them against the blows. But those cases were the minority. The majority were able to improve quickly and meaningfully. And that's what made it so much fun.
There isn't anything more practical than developing a vision. It's not some fantasy exercise like pie in the sky. Without a vision, your life is chaotic, fragmented, hopeless, and filled with disappointment. Without vision, you can be stopped by a single obstacle. You become a house divided against itself, with no forward momentum and no enthusiasm. To be filled with vision is, in a sense, to be filled with the Spirit of God. Without it, your life becomes nothing more than a string of frustrations, tragedies, and disappointments. You become like a leaf blowing in the wind. But that is not what you're called to be. You're called to be a visionary builder of a paradisal future. That is truly what you are, as difficult and terrifying as it may be to realize. And what do you really have to lose by embracing that role? After all, in the end, we all lose everything anyway. Whether we like it or not, we are already betting everything on this life. When you wake up in the morning, what is it that confronts you? Some might say it's the material reality around you, driving you like clockwork. But that's not how it appears to us phenomenologically. What you actually face is a field of potential. For some, that field is constrained. For others, it is wider, but it's always present. It represents the range of possibilities of what that day could be. Each day carries with it this domain of what could be. You wake up and see in front of you a variety of ways things could unfold. You know there may be difficult decisions to make. You might feel the pull to avoid those hard choices and take the easy way out. But you also have a sense of how things could go if you handled them properly, or if you dodged them, or if you took the easiest path. You can sense how the future will likely unfold depending on the actions you choose. When you rise and act, or fail to act, you transform the potential of the future into the reality of the present and the past. This is what consciousness means. It is the thing within you that in the oldest sense is made in the image of God, the God who created the world at the beginning of time. Consciousness is the element that transforms the chaotic potential of the indeterminate future into the actual, concrete reality we inhabit. We do this through our moral choices. The book of Genesis describes God using the Logos, the creative word, to perform exactly this function, transforming chaos into habitable order. And what was created was good. This is repeated again and again in the text. It carries with it a profound ethical idea. We too have the power, within our grasp, to take the world as it is, with all its suffering and malevolence, and through confronting it with truth, to transform the potential into something good. This is the ethical demand placed upon us. Our decisions matter. Each choice is a step upward toward the good or downward into the negative. And if enough people make decisions that move downward, the world begins to collapse into something so close to hell that the difference is almost meaningless. You may not believe in heaven, and perhaps you may not even believe in God, but you can certainly believe in the destructive power of your own cowardly indecision. You can see how relying on deceit instead of courage and truth creates a world of suffering around you. That is within the realm of belief because it is plainly visible. Even if someone is not a believer in heaven, and even if they are not a believer in God, they can easily believe in the destructive power of their own cowardice and indecision. They can recognize how the determination to use deceit instead of confronting life courageously and truthfully produces something dreadful in the world around them. When people surrender to lies, manipulation, or avoidance, they bring into existence an environment that becomes unbearable. It may not appear as some mythical hell with fire and demons, but it is a kind of hell nonetheless, one made by human hands and human choices. It is the kind of existence where suffering deepens, relationships collapse, and the future darkens into despair. This is not some distant abstraction. It's a reality people can see in their own families, workplaces, and communities. Deceit and cowardice corrode the structure of being itself. They twist what could have been transformed into good, and instead they leave people trapped in bitterness and regret. In contrast, when truth is spoken and responsibility is taken up, something miraculous occurs. The very same chaotic potential of the world is reshaped into order and meaning. Each small act of truth builds toward a greater vision of good, and each courageous step forward adds strength to the foundation of a meaningful life. That is why the demand is ethical and unavoidable. Each person is constantly standing at a crossroads. Every choice, whether to face the difficulty honestly or to turn away into deceit, either builds a reality that moves toward the good or collapses into the negative. It is not just a private matter. The collective choices of individuals shape entire societies. When enough people walk down the path of avoidance, cowardice, and deceit, they create systems that reflect exactly those qualities. That is how cultures descend into corruption, and how nations turn into prisons. But when enough people act truthfully and courageously, the opposite happens. Order emerges, hope strengthens, and even tragedy can be faced with dignity.
That is hell, for all intents and purposes.
And I think that was the great lesson of the 20th century. I think that's exactly what happened. The reason it happened, I believe, is because individuals abandoned their moral responsibility. And that moral responsibility is, in some sense, absolute. So absolute that it can feel unbearable. Having said that, my conclusion, because of all that, and for other reasons as well, was that it is true that life is suffering, tainted by malevolence. But there is also a power of spirit within the human being that enables him or her to confront that suffering forthrightly, with nobility of purpose, and to transcend the suffering while constraining the malevolence. That power is within our grasp. And what that means, fundamentally, is that despite the undeniable structural reality of human limitation and evil, the spirit of the human being is so powerful in its potential that it can face those realities, accept them as a fundamental responsibility, and then transcend them, and even repair them as a consequence. This perspective was an inversion of the most pessimistic possible view, the belief that life is nothing but ineradicable suffering and malevolence. Instead, it becomes the opposite view. If life is voluntarily confronted, then suffering and malevolence can be transcended and rectified. That, I believe, is the sacred responsibility of every single person. Worse still, the abdication of that responsibility, which is admittedly almost unbearable in its weight, creates a void in the structure of reality, and that void is not left empty, it is filled by something hellish. So it is not merely that you fail to make things better when you avoid doing what you know to be right, it is that your failure leaves behind a space, and that space becomes filled by something dreadful. The conclusion of all this was that the collectivists were wrong. Instead, those who insisted that the individual is the sovereign foundation of the state were right. Each individual carries within them an element that provides the rationale for that foundational sovereignty. And it is this same element that is the reason for our equality before God and before the law. That is correct in the most fundamental sense. Since realizing this, what I have attempted to do is to remind individuals that there is far more to them than they are willing to believe, and whether or not they manifest that properly in the world makes far more difference than they can possibly imagine. The downside of this realization is the crushing weight of voluntarily adopting your moral burden. But the upside is the discovery of the nobility that resides within you, a nobility of sufficient strength and force to be aligned with the most fundamental realities of existence itself. That nobility becomes a wellspring of strength, one powerful enough, if you draw upon it properly, to allow you to bear the suffering and malevolence of the world without becoming corrupted by it. Someone once said, "I'm 40, but I feel like a child, watching everyone around me grow older and die. I'm homesick for the past instead of accepting the terrifying present. How can I stop mourning the past?" What you are suffering from is what Freud described as reminiscences of the past. You are possessed by them. They will not let go of your mind. That means one of two things. Either there are unresolved events in your past that you need to understand more deeply, or there are things you had in your past that you still need in the present and the future. One way to work through this is to do a past authoring program, writing out your past in detail. Break your life into different stages. 6 is a useful number, but you could use more or fewer. Then write out the most emotionally significant events of each stage, both positive and negative. This process helps put the past to rest. It can also highlight what exactly it is you are nostalgic for, and that can guide you toward what to aim for in the future. It sounds like you are hopeless about the present, and by implication about the future. That might be because you have not developed a rich enough conception of what the future could be. Going back into your past can show you what you once wanted and once had, and then you can make a plan for how to obtain something like it in the future. Of course, this becomes more complicated when you bring in the subject of death.
Perhaps you were longing for a return to a state of blissful ignorance, a time when mortality wasn't part of your awareness. The only real medicine for that longing, however, is to live a life that is as worthwhile and as full as possible, so full that you do not regret it. I am not sure that people are afraid of death itself as much as they are afraid of not having lived enough. And maybe, if you lived fully enough, you could let go when the time came. So if you are overly afraid of death, it may be because you still have a great deal of unlived life within you. Returning to your past can help you identify what you needed then and perhaps still need now. Then you can strive to attain that in your present and in your future. Exercises like this can, at least in principle, help you. Ask yourself, what are you missing? What did the past hold for you that the present does not? Write it down. For example, perhaps you once had a loving relationship, and now you don't. Perhaps you once had the security of a comfortable home life, and now you lack it. Those missing pieces are not merely gaps, they can become ambitions. Lack and ambition are mirror images of one another. If you can identify what you lack, you can transform it into something to aim for. You may think it is impossible, but if you decompose it into smaller steps, you can move toward it. Yes, it is complicated, but life is complicated, and there is no way around that. You are always somewhere because you have to be somewhere, but you might not know exactly where that is. And when you don't know where you are, that means your life is chaotic. When you are lost, you don't know where to go. And when you don't know where to go, you are confronted with millions of possible directions. But a million directions is far too many to walk without dying. Being lost is dangerous. So you need to know where you are. That is why we created the Past Authoring Program. It allows people to lay out the narrative of their past, to break their lives down into stages, and to see the structure of their own story more clearly.
One of the things that we built online, my partners and I, is a program called Past Authoring. This program helps people lay out the narrative of their past. It asks them to break their life into 6 stages, although you can choose more or fewer if you prefer, and then to write about the significant positive and negative events that occurred in each stage. By doing this, you create a clear picture of where you have been, and that helps you understand where you are now. Because if you do not know where you are, then you are lost. And when you are lost, you don't know where to go. And when you don't know where to go, you face a million possible paths. But a million possible paths is far too many to walk without collapsing. That's why being lost is such a dangerous state. This past authoring process allows you to organize the chaos of your own story, to establish where you stand, and to identify the unresolved experiences that may still be influencing you in ways you don't fully understand. It helps transform your life from something fragmented and confusing into something that has a clear narrative direction. When you carry experiences from the past that remain unexamined and unresolved, they weigh you down in the present. If there are events that were painful, confusing, or filled with regret, and you never face them directly, they stay alive in you as unfinished business. These memories do not simply fade away. Instead, they influence the way you think, the way you act, and even the way you see the future. They whisper doubts, fears, and distortions into your current decisions. Without realizing it, you may avoid opportunities, sabotage relationships, or repeat mistakes, all because those old experiences have not yet been brought into the light. That is why it is so valuable to write about them, to put them into words, to structure them, and to clarify what actually happened. Writing forces you to break down vague feelings into clear understanding. And with understanding comes the possibility of resolution. By mapping out the story of your life, you discover patterns that were invisible before. You see what has been driving you and what has been holding you back. You also begin to realize that your past does not need to be a chain. It can be transformed into a foundation for the future, but only if it is faced honestly. When you write about your past, the jumble of thoughts and feelings that once seemed overwhelming becomes organized. Events that felt chaotic take on a sequence. Causes and effects become clearer. You begin to see that some of the things that happened to you were not your fault, while others were the result of choices you made. This distinction is crucial because it allows you to take responsibility where it belongs and release guilt where it does not. The act of writing slows down your thinking. It forces you to put vague impressions into precise language. In that precision, the fog lifts, and you are no longer prey to shadows and ghosts from the past. Instead, you face realities you can name, and therefore manage. By working through these events, you can resolve them. Sometimes that resolution means forgiving yourself or someone else. Sometimes it means recognizing a lesson that was hidden in the pain. Other times it simply means acknowledging what happened so it no longer haunts you in silence. Reframing the past does not mean denying it or pretending it was good when it wasn't. It means placing it in the larger story of your life in a way that gives you strength rather than weakness. What once was only suffering can become experience, and what once was only chaos can become wisdom. Through this process, you establish where you are in the present. Because until you know where you are, you cannot know where to go. If you are lost, you have no direction. And when you have no direction, you are paralyzed by infinite choices. But once you know where you stand, the path forward begins to reveal itself. That is the central value of the past authoring program. It transforms the confusion of memory into a structured story. It takes what was disorganized and turns it into order. And from order, the possibility of progress emerges. In the past authoring program, life is divided into what we call epochs. Within each epoch, you identify the emotionally significant moments. You write out what happened, both the negative and the positive. You describe what the consequences were, what you derived from those events, and perhaps what you could have done differently. You also reflect on what you learned from them. All of this helps you narrow down and zero in on determining precisely where you are right now. Many people are reluctant to go through this process. They would rather stay spread out in a half-blind fog, hoping that the place they are in is better than it really is. They cling to vagueness because vagueness allows self-delusion. It feels easier to drift in uncertainty than to admit, I am right here, right now, with these specific problems. But it is actually better to face those problems directly. If you can narrow them down and specify them clearly, then you can begin to fix them, step by step in small ways. Without knowing where you are, it is impossible to move forward. There is a straightforward way to know if you are avoiding your past. If you are still haunted by memories older than about 18 months, if they continue to surface in your thoughts or appear repeatedly in your dreams, it means you have not fully extracted the potential meaning from those experiences. That potential is still trapped in the past. To confront it means confronting the dragon of the past, and that can be terrifying. It may even be overwhelming. For example, maybe you are vague and ill-formed because you were abused as a very young child, perhaps around 4 years old, often tragically by a family member. That makes it even worse. Such experiences amount to a direct encounter with malevolent evil, and they leave behind an implicit hypothesis of evil that continues to plague you. Those memories are still trapped in your psychological structure. As an adult, you are faced with the necessity of articulating that experience fully before you can ever hope to free yourself from it. That is no small task.
This is why psychoanalysts often guide people back into the past. They help uncover the events that knocked a person down and left them unable to recover. It is not always repression, as Freud suggested, though Freud himself was a genius despite his errors. More often, it is simply that terrible things happen to people at an age far too young for them to understand why. They cannot grasp what happened, what it meant, or what to do with it. And yet they carry it forward into adulthood, burdened by something unresolved. The human body reacts to the world in rapid stages.
For example, if you are walking down a road and hear a loud noise behind you, you crouch instantly. That is a predator defense response, an automatic attempt to protect your neck from attack. It happens in just a few hundred milliseconds, faster than conscious thought. It must be that fast because something like a snake can strike in an instant. This kind of response is low resolution. It only signals danger in a broad sense, like predator or snake. It takes more time to unravel the details, to categorize what is really happening. That process unfolds first through emotion, then through cognition, and finally through deliberate, long-term thinking. Sometimes, in adulthood, people encounter specific forms of malevolence, such as a destructive bully at work. This person may have no positive function at all, existing only to make others' lives miserable. When that happens, you can fall into prey mode. You are forced to ask terrible questions. What is wrong with this person? Why are they targeting me? What is it about me that allows them to do this? Walking down that road can be painful, but often necessary. Yet sometimes the complexity is overwhelming. Maybe you cannot even formulate an explicit philosophy of good and evil to explain what you are facing. And that is no surprise. It is difficult for young people, and it is often too much even for adults. This is also what many soldiers with post-traumatic stress disorder endure. They have encountered terrible things, sometimes inflicted, sometimes suffered, and these events demand an update to their moral model of the world. Without that update, they remain trapped in a state that closely approximates hell. To move forward, you must know where you are. Life is navigation. You are like a sailor on the ocean, moving from point A to point B. You are not a fixed creature rooted to a rock like a brainless hydra. There is, in fact, a simple little creature called a hydra. In its juvenile stage, it has a brain because it swims around, but once it matures, it latches onto a rock and digests its brain because it no longer needs it. Humans, however, are not like that. We are mobile creatures, navigating agents, and to navigate, you must know two things. Where you are, exactly and precisely, you must take stock of what is good about you and what is bad about you, according to your own reckoning. This is not about pleasing others, but about honest self-assessment. And what needs work. You must acknowledge both strengths and flaws without slipping into destructive self-criticism, which can itself become another flaw. Work itself is not merely a way to avoid starvation, although in the harshest sense that is part of it. Much of work is routine, but it is also deeply connected to socialization, commitment, and meaning. A psychologist from North Dakota State University, who studies meaning from an existential perspective, wrote an article in Newsweek criticizing the idea of universal basic income. His point was that one of the things driving people to suicide is the belief that they are functionless burdens. Now, imagine a segment of the population being told, in effect, we cannot think of anything useful for you to do, but we also do not want to watch you starve. So here is some money. For many conscientious people, such a message would produce despair. Providing money may solve the immediate problem of survival, but it is not a sophisticated solution to the deeper human need for purpose. That is because work carries dignity. Human beings are like pack animals. We need to pull, to contribute, to take part in something larger than ourselves. Some people need this more than others, but for those high in conscientiousness, it is absolutely vital.
One of the big 5 personality traits is conscientiousness. People who are conscientious simply cannot tolerate having nothing to do. When they are idle, they fall into despair. It is not in their nature to avoid work. This is absolutely true. For example, when people discuss the tragedy of veteran suicide, the focus is often on post-service struggles. But the deeper question is why suicide is not equally addressed among those on active duty. The answer may not only lie in PTSD, but also in the sudden loss of purpose and mission. I spent years studying military personnel at the U.S. Naval Academy, examining what predicts military success.
Apart from general cognitive ability, which is essentially IQ and predicts success in any complex field, the strongest predictor was trait conscientiousness. These individuals live for duty. They're like sled dogs. Without a purpose, they become desperate. The benefit of conscientiousness is greater success through hard work and long hours. The downside is that when a person loses their job or feels unnecessary, they can fall into deep despair. Critics, especially radical leftists, often accuse me of speaking from privilege and power. But they do not know me, nor do they understand how I reached this position. It was not a birthright. As a child, I was younger than my peers, wore thick glasses, was unathletic, and endured hardships because of my loud mouth and intellect. These were not the markings of privilege. To assume that competence, authority, and social position are simply rewards of privilege is wrong. People often reach these positions because of a combination of hard work, good fortune, supportive environments, and the absence of major health disasters. Their success is not a handout, it is the consequence of producing something valuable. Society rewards productivity not out of kindness or equity, but because it wants to extract as much value as possible from productive individuals. Payment is not a pat on the back, it is the incentive required to keep them producing. So the narrative that people in positions of competence are merely oppressive, patriarchal figures must be abandoned. Citizens have the right to benefit from their labor, not because we feel generous, but because such benefits fuel further productivity. Self-interest drives this system, but it is the right kind of self-interest. People often argue that society is corrupt and that the top 1% hold all the wealth. Yet the reality is that membership in the top 1% changes rapidly. Statistically, you have about a 10% chance of spending at least 1 year in the top 1% during your lifetime. The distribution of wealth has always been unequal. It is a natural law, identified as far back as the late 1800s by Alfredo Pareto. Goods and wealth naturally distribute unevenly across societies. This imbalance does not mean corruption drives the structure, it is simply how economies function. Consider Elon Musk. He aims to launch rockets every 5 days, eliminate fossil fuel cars, and revolutionize energy through solar grids and batteries. Perhaps he should have even more money than he already does because his vision may transform the world. Of course, some wealthy individuals may waste their fortune on indulgence, but many use their wealth for creative and groundbreaking endeavors. Figures like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates revolutionized human life through their innovations. Instead of focusing on envy and resentment, perhaps society should show gratitude that such people exist and push humanity forward. Research shows that conscientious people who lose their jobs are far more likely to become depressed. This is because these traits are deeply embedded in personality. Each person carries sub-personalities tied to their traits. For example, highly open people must create or they wither away. Highly extroverted people must socialize or they dry up and lose vitality. Conscientiousness is similar. It is not optional but essential. For such individuals, having purpose is their defining characteristic. This is particularly true in the military, which is designed for conscientious people. The structure, discipline, and hierarchy all align with this trait. The Naval Academy once asked whether creativity could also be selected for, since leadership roles require independent thinking. This is a challenge. Most military regiments are best suited for conscientious individuals, not necessarily for the highly creative. Creative and open individuals thrive in advanced leadership, but the difficulty lies in reaching those positions. Without high conscientiousness, individuals risk trouble moving through the ranks. This dilemma also exists in corporations. At lower levels, conscientiousness is vital, while openness can even be disruptive. Yet at higher levels of leadership, openness becomes an asset. The challenge is finding the balance and the path for individuals with different trait profiles.
My dad was a school teacher, and he is still alive today. He became disappointed with teaching in part because all of the authority in his classroom was taken away from him. If there were discipline problems in class, he had to pass them up the chain to the administrators above him. He could feel his authority slipping away, even though he was a naturally authoritative teacher. My dad was also my teacher in grade 6, specifically for math. I was not in his homeroom, but I remember it clearly. By grade 6, when kids are about 12 years old, they can be very pushy and difficult.
But the first time my dad walked into the room, 10 minutes before class started, everyone went completely silent. He had a strong reputation, and that reputation was simple: don't mess with him. It wasn't because he was mean, but because he had a firm backbone. You simply didn't want to push him. He was authoritative. My dad also became disenchanted with television. When he was younger, and even when I was young, there were shows like My Three Sons and Father Knows Best. Imagine a show today called Father Knows Best. That would be impossible now. The only modern show I've seen that comes close is Ted Lasso. For about 5 decades, it is the only sitcom I have seen with a genuinely positive male lead, so credit goes to Ted Lasso. You also see a bit of that dynamic in The Simpsons. That's one reason why it was such an interestingly subversive show. Homer is a bumbling fool, and Marge often has the moral upper hand, but not completely. Homer, despite being foolish, is always trying. He is not very smart, but he wants to be a good father. He is faithful to his wife and cares about his kids, so there is a kind of underlying stability in that male character. But still, it feels like faint praise. Now young men are under attack from 2 main directions. First, all male authority is described as nothing more than patriarchal oppression. So imagine you are a young man with ambition, wanting to build authority and responsibility. But now you were told that this ambition is only a sign of the power dynamics that created a patriarchal and oppressive colonial tyranny. So if you are a moral young man, you might think, my ambition is not only questionable, it must be completely crushed, because it is nothing more than a form of power. Maybe you somehow escape that attack, but then comes the second one. All human activity, you are told, is nothing but destruction of the planet, feeding the fire that will eventually consume the earth. So now you are not only part of oppressive patriarchy, but also a destroyer of Mother Nature. If boys are constantly told this, and they are, how can they find motivation? And then on top of that, they are told that any sexual advance toward women is to be viewed with extreme suspicion. At the same time, they are fed pornography endlessly. That becomes an easy way out, but it is also unbelievably powerful. Pornography is like a drug. No one really thinks this through, but now any 12 or 13-year-old boy can see more beautiful naked women in 15 minutes than the richest king in history saw in his entire life. People say, oh, we don't need to worry about that. But no, we absolutely need to worry about it. It is a huge and demoralizing problem because it provides an easy escape. If ambition is treated only as a symptom of power and must be crushed out of boys as early as possible, schools add to the problem. Boys are punished for playing. Hyperactivity is often just suppressed play behavior. There are good animal studies on this. For example, with rats, who are very playful, if you deprive them of play, especially juvenile male rats, then when you finally allow it, they play in hyperactive bursts. This can be suppressed with methylphenidate, which is Ritalin. It reduces play behavior and forces attention. But maybe it's not attention deficit at all. Maybe boys simply need to be outside on the playground, running around and playing for far longer than they are allowed, with their rough, competitive play. But instead we hear, we don't need competition. All games should be cooperative. That is complete nonsense. A game isn't a game if it is only cooperative, and it is a very silly way to view cooperation. If you and I play one-on-one basketball, are we competing or cooperating? Well, we are cooperating because we both agreed on the rules and we are playing the same game. But we are also competing because each of us is making it harder for the other to score. That difficulty forces improvement. So in reality, cooperation and competition exist together. When you and I play basketball, you make it harder for me to hit the target. But because of that, I get better at aiming for the target. If we both do that well, it becomes fun. Why fun? Because humans are target-seeking creatures. The word sin itself comes from the Greek word hamartia, which means to miss the target. In Jewish tradition, there is a similar meaning.
When we compete, we set a shared target and then we create a challenging structure that forces us to improve while aiming for it. All sports revolve around this, whether it's crossing the finish line first in running or swimming, or aiming at a basket in basketball, or hitting a goal in football. These are all about hitting the target. Humans are natural hunters, and our mind is designed to aim at targets. That's why sports and competition are so deeply satisfying. The point of competition isn't just to defeat someone else, it's to make each other better at reaching the target. If you deviate from the target, you miss the mark. That is sin. And when you miss the mark, you feel guilty.
Well, you should be. You're supposed to hit the mark. And what is the mark? The mark is the line between order and chaos. The mark is the playful engagement in good conversation. The mark is being immersed in a really intense game. An intense game where you are serious about it, where the other person is pushing you right to your absolute limit, and you are doing the same in return. Carl Jung, the psychoanalyst, said that the fool is the precursor to the savior. Why is that? Because the fool is the one who will tell the truth, and you cannot redeem yourself without telling the truth. And in the king's court, well, the court might be the place where the evil king rules. That's one possibility. But if the evil king is ruling, then you need the fool. Why? Because the fool is beneath contempt, so the fool can say anything. But then, is the fool really the fool, or is the fool the king? Because if the fool is the only one free enough to speak the truth, it is not obvious that the king is in control. It might actually be the fool who holds the real power. Yet the fool doesn't carry the burden of administration, the responsibility of running everything. His responsibility is to be funny, yes, but more than that, it is the responsibility to tell the truth. At the very least, he is the one who feeds truth into the culture. One marker of someone you cannot trust is when they have no sense of humor. When they say, "I don't see why that's funny," that's a very sad sign. And then they say, "There are some things comedians should not be allowed to make fun of." Well, who decides that? You? Are you going to regulate what people are allowed to find funny? Are you going to regulate that unconscious manifestation of humor and claim pridefully that the world will be better because of it? If you are the kind of king who cannot stand the fool, then you are not a king. You are a tyrant. If I would like to be remembered for anything, I suppose it would be as someone who encouraged others. Because what I believe I am doing, primarily, is encouraging people. Yes, you are full of problems and you are surrounded by massive snakes, but fundamentally, you are the thing that can handle the snakes. And not only do I believe that, I know it is true. So I try to tell people, yes, you may be a sad case, but there is far more to you than you imagine. There is enough inside you to cope with the trouble of the world. And if you had enough courage, enough faith, you could let that out. And if you did, everything would be better because of it. For a long time, people have criticized me for speaking to disaffected young men as though that is a terrible thing to do. But I thought the marginalized were supposed to have a voice. It is deeply emotional to talk about because it is difficult to truly understand how demoralized many people are, especially young men. And when they are dismissed with casual insults called incels, what does that even mean? It means they don't know how to make themselves attractive to women. And women are picky, and good for them. Women should be picky. That is their gift. Demand high standards from men. That is fair enough. But what about all these men who are alienated, who are lonesome, who don't know what to do, and instead of help, everyone piles abuse on them? When Olivia Wilde made her comment about me, yes, it stung at first, but honestly, as insults go, it was low level. Once I had already been painted as Red Skull, the magical super Nazi, that was about as far as insults could go. There's no step past that. So when she said what she said, I looked up the preview of her movie, and I actually thought it looked good. I even said I would probably watch it, and maybe I still will. It didn't bother me deeply, my family and I talked about it right away, and we responded with humor. I even joked that if someone was going to play me, I hoped it would be Chris Pine, because he is a very good-looking man. And then I joked further that I hoped he would get my fashion style right when he portrayed me. But people completely misunderstood. It was all meant as a joke. You've noticed I've been controlled in this conversation, but yes, I did get emotional for a brief moment. Why? Because it is something I see constantly, how many people are literally dying for the lack of an encouraging word. And the astonishing thing is how easy it is to provide encouragement if you are careful, if you give credit where credit is due, if you are willing to say, you are a net force for good if you want to be. Do I believe I am a net force for good? Yes, overall I do. In the details, probably not. No one is perfect. People make mistakes as they stumble uphill. But in the larger picture, I believe so. And here's something else I find strange. More than 90% of the people who watch my videos on YouTube are men. That is odd, because in psychology programs, about 80% of students are women, so you would expect that the majority of my audience would be women as well. Some say it's because of the political stance I have taken, but I checked the demographic data from before I ever made political content, and at that time, 85% of my audience was already male. So yes, it has increased by about 6%, which is not trivial, but it was already overwhelmingly male from the beginning.
I have noticed this in live events as well. When I spoke at the University of Toronto free speech debate, I looked around the room before the debate even started. I was talking about the intrinsic differences between men and women, and I suddenly realized about 80% of the people in that room were men. At one of my talks, I asked all the women to stand up and then all the men to stand up. And I said, look, here's a natural experiment. For some reason, 80% of the people who showed up here are men. Now, everyone thought I was a bit cracked to do that. It was a risk, no doubt. But I thought, no, there's something important happening here. And since then, I've noticed that every public appearance I make, when it's related to the kinds of topics we are discussing, the audience is overwhelmingly male, sometimes 85% to 90%. I kept asking myself, what the hell is going on here exactly? One thing I've also noticed is that when I speak to these crowds, I'm not talking about rights, I'm talking about responsibility. Because you cannot have a conversation about rights without also having a conversation about responsibility. Your rights are, technically, my responsibility. That's how it works. So, if we are only talking about rights, then we are only having half the discussion. And if we leave responsibility out of the discussion, the question becomes, what are we leaving out? The answer might be that we are leaving out the meaning of life. Because here you are, suffering. What makes the suffering worthwhile? Rights? No, that is almost impossible to describe how bad of an idea that is. Responsibility, that is what gives life meaning. When you pick up responsibility, when you lift a load, you can actually tolerate yourself. Look at yourself. You are weak, you are easily hurt, you are easily killed. Why should you have any self-respect? That's the story of the fall. But if you pick something up and carry it, if you make it heavy enough, you can at least say, well, useless as I am, at least I moved that from there to there. And what's amazing is when I speak about this, young men's eyes light up. The idea of responsibility, that's a whole new order of meaning for them. They are unbelievably hungry for it. I was watching The Simpsons the other day, the very first episode, and I deconstructed it. It was really interesting. It's Christmas, and Homer and Marge are planning to buy presents. But Homer doesn't get his Christmas bonus, and he is absolutely crushed by that. That theme recurs throughout the series. Homer loses his job, or he doesn't make enough money, and he's devastated. Even though he is this bumbling, foolish, laughing character, what gives the show its soul is that he is still oriented toward his family. That is what makes him honorable.
Foolish as he has decided to adopt responsibility for his family and try to bear it. He is not a complete fool. He is a holy fool. And he suffers dreadfully when he cannot fulfill his responsibilities. Now, men and women have different sets of responsibilities. They are not the same because life is complicated. Women, by biological necessity, take primary responsibility for bringing infants into the world and for caring for them. That is both a biological and partly a psychological issue. Women know what they have to do. Men, on the other hand, have to figure it out. And if they don't have something worth living for, then they stay Peter Pan forever. And why not? Because the alternative to valued responsibility is impulsive, low-class pleasure. Some people say, well, your fans are men and they're struggling with their manhood, and you tell them it's okay to be a man. But I don't say it's okay, I say it's necessary. What the hell are we going to do without men? Look around the city. See these buildings? Men built them. See the streets and sewers? Men are down there working underground. See the power lines during storms and rain? Men are up there keeping the system going. They are doing impossible things. They are working themselves to death, often literally. And yet the gratitude for that is sorely lacking, especially from the people who should be the most grateful. Take university professors of the social justice bent, for example. They are among the most protected and privileged people in the history of the world. And yet they take everything they have for granted. They fail to understand that the very foundation of their comfortable existence is built on the backs of hard-working, solid, laboring men who break themselves in half every day to make sure that what always breaks keeps working. A little gratitude for that is in order. It is very useful to tell not only men, but everyone that they have an important role to play, a necessary role. And if they act properly, honestly, and forthrightly, then they can put their lives together.
It's not all about power. In fact, if you try to build your relationships on power, you will fail. Take marriage as an example. Imagine deciding that with your wife, you will rely only on power. Well, try it and see what happens. She will be miserable, resentful, and perhaps she will even have more power than you when push comes to shove. Women are not that easy to oppress. They have their own strategies, their own strengths, their own ways of pushing back. At the very least, you would be setting yourself up for a loveless relationship built on mutual suspicion. Now imagine you use power with your children. Yes, from time to time, discipline is necessary. You must set the rules of the game, but that's not the same as ruling them with oppression. If your fundamental relationship with your children is one of dominance, then you're nothing but a tyrant. And what if you tried the same approach with your friends? Well, you won't have friends. The best you'll manage are henchmen, people who stick around only because they hope to gain something from your power. That's the worst kind of friend. They're not even confident enough to be bullies on their own. They must hide behind someone else and act as sub-bullies. That's a pitiful outcome. Even in business, power fails. If your business relationships are built on dominance, no one will be aligned with you. The very first mistake you make, the very first sign of weakness you show, your so-called allies will stab you in the back and leave. It's a ridiculous geary. Power as the foundation of human interaction doesn't even work for chimpanzees. The best research on chimpanzees has been done by Franz de Waal, who has studied them for over 3 decades and written extensively about the emergence of proto-morality among them. Chimps live in social groups for decades. They form what we might as well call friendships, because that is the closest human parallel. These friendships cannot be maintained by dominance. If they were, they would not be friendships at all. Instead, they are maintained through mutual grooming, caretaking, and reciprocity. Now, people often imagine the alpha chimp as the biggest, roughest, most aggressive member of the troop. He bangs sticks, makes threats, and fights his way up the hierarchy, just as a Marxist might assume. And yes, he establishes sexual superiority and propagates his genes. That is better than being weak and useless, better than dying without offspring. But it is not nearly as effective as being reciprocal. Franz de Waal has shown that sometimes the alpha chimp is not the largest or strongest male at all. In fact, sometimes the alpha is the smallest member of the troop. What sets him apart is that he is the most reciprocal, the one most deeply invested in maintaining relationships. He grooms his companions, he builds alliances, he interacts constantly. He keeps track of the social web around him and invests in it like mad. And that brings two major advantages. First, he gains reverence, authority, and preferential sexual access, so it is a successful biological strategy. Second, the group itself becomes more stable because it is not ruled by a tyrant who constantly disrupts things. And there's another key benefit. A reciprocal alpha has a much longer reign. If a chimp climbs the hierarchy by manipulation and brute force, his power is fragile. The moment he shows weakness, two of the males he has oppressed will form an alliance, and chimps are excellent at coalition building, and they will tear him apart. Franz de Waal has written very graphic accounts of these violent revolutions against tyranny in chimpanzee groups. They are brutal and frightening, but they make one thing clear. Even among chimpanzees, power alone cannot hold. So when people claim that power is the only human motivation, they have no ground to stand on.
It is simply not true that power is the only thing that motivates people. But here's the problem. If you believe that power is the only motivation, then you are automatically justified in using it at every step. After all, if nothing but power exists, then why not wield it? That belief becomes more of a confession than an accusation. And yet there is a grain of truth hidden in the critique. When systems break down, when corruption spreads and everything begins to deteriorate, power does emerge as the central force. This is why Marxist and postmodernist critiques can sound so convincing. They point to the undeniable fact that power corrupts, and when corruption has taken over an enterprise, a family, a society, or even a relationship, then yes, power becomes the dominant phenomenon. In totalitarian states, for instance, life truly is about power. But that is a far cry from saying that everything, at all times, is founded on power. It is more accurate to say everything corrupt is based on power, but not everything is corrupt. To understand this better, we have to look back, not just a few centuries or millennia, but millions of years. At some point, long before we were speaking creatures, we separated from the common ancestor we share with chimpanzees, around 6 million years ago. Slowly, across that long evolutionary arc, we learned first to imitate ourselves, then to represent ourselves in image and action, and eventually to articulate our thoughts in words. But even deeper than language lies something older, our embodiment. We carry in our very form an implicit way of being shaped by eons of survival within structured groups. In fact, we have existed inside hierarchical social structures for far longer than we've shared any common ancestor with chimpanzees, perhaps as long as 350 million years. So the question becomes, if we have always lived in hierarchies, what qualities reliably move an individual upward in those hierarchies? This matters because moving upward increases the likelihood of survival and reproductive success. Over hundreds of millions of years, nothing could have been more important than finding stable ways to climb that structure. Imagine gathering 100 men together. Inevitably, they will organize themselves into a hierarchy. The alternative would be chaos and endless fighting. Now, who rises to the top? It might be the strongest physically, yes, but that's not the whole story. Leaders can also rise through competence, intelligence, or by embodying the values of the group itself. It is almost as though the group collectively votes, consciously or unconsciously, on who best represents its spirit. Leadership in that sense is a kind of earned authority. And in evolutionary terms, this matters deeply. The man who embodies leadership qualities is more likely to pass on his genes to the next generation. This isn't a small effect. It is enormous. Among men, historically, roughly half did not reproduce at all. The competition for successful reproduction has always been fierce, and hierarchy played a central role in determining who succeeded and who did not.
Chimpanzees show this clearly. They too have dominance hierarchies, and one might imagine that the alpha chimp is always the biggest brute, the caveman type, pounding his rivals into submission. But Frans de Waal, who has studied chimps for decades, found something far more subtle. The power-hungry, tyrannical chimp can seize control for a time, but his rule tends to be unstable. Why? Because he's poor at grooming others, poor at building social connections, poor at attending to the young, and unpopular with females. He may dominate through fear, but his kingdom is fragile. The strongest leader is not merely the toughest fighter, it is the one who balances strength with reciprocity, who grooms his allies, maintains friendships, and keeps the troop emotionally stable. In other words, even among chimps, the alpha is not simply a tyrant. He is, above all, a social leader. Picture the tyrant chimp, the loud, aggressive one who bangs sticks and bullies his way to the top of the troop. For a while, he rules by fear. But then one day, he slips. Maybe he gorges on fermented bananas and wakes up sluggish, slow to react. That's when two subordinate chimps, who have quietly been grooming each other, building trust and friendship, see their chance. Together, they strike, and in a sudden explosion of violence, the tyrant is torn to pieces. Frans de Waal's studies revealed something profound. It is not the tyrannical chimps who survive and thrive as leaders. It is the more humane chimps, those who build bonds, groom their companions, and maintain reciprocal relationships, who create stable hierarchies and remain on top for longer. This is not mere dominance. It is the earliest form of morality, acted out in the jungle. From this we learn there are many ways to climb a hierarchy. Some lead to short-lived power, others to enduring stability. The evolutionary payoff is immense. Those who lead well, with reciprocity and care, leave more descendants. And so, over countless generations, the very structure of hierarchies has shaped who we are. Among chimps, females in heat will mate indiscriminately. Dominant males push the weaker ones aside, ensuring more offspring. But it is largely about access, not preference. Humans are different. Human females are choosy, brutally so. They don't just accept whoever is near, they select. And here lies the evolutionary crucible. Men compete for the higher rungs of the hierarchy, and women select from the top. Humanity itself is born from this intense interplay of male competition and female choice. Unlike chimps, where brute force can secure a brief rule, human society has been sculpted by layers of competence, stability, and selection pressure that reward more than just raw dominance. But not all suffering comes from the hierarchy of nature. Sometimes life itself delivers catastrophe, unjust, brutal, undeserved. In these moments, bitterness and resentment are natural responses. To feel like a victim when tragedy strikes is not always weakness. It can be the plain truth. The real question is there an alternative? This is where the search for heroes becomes essential. We look outward, to examples of those who endured unbearable suffering and yet carried themselves with grace. In one story, a young mother, faced with breast cancer, fought a losing battle for 5 years. She had young children, a future cut short, a life stolen. And yet, instead of collapsing under the weight of despair, she carried herself with courage, leaving her children not with bitterness, but with an unshakable belief that they too could endure hardship and prevail. That is extraordinary. That is the essence of heroism. When we encounter such stories, we are reminded thousands have faced horror before us, and they endured. If they could, perhaps so can we. It isn't about denying that pain is real or pretending suffering doesn't matter. It's about recognizing that complaint and resentment are not the way forward. The optimistic truth, the judgment, and the gift is this: If someone else has done it, so can you. And this is where the book guides the reader. Notice who you admire. Look to the heroes, both grand and ordinary. Then begin, even in small steps, to practice becoming like them. Because within those stories, within those lives, is a mirror of your own potential. In the fronts to walls sense, the deepest source of emotion is tied to the observation of movement toward a valued goal. From this realization, a set of profound conclusions can be drawn. The first is simple but undeniable. Without a goal, there can be no happiness. Happiness is not a static possession. It is the emotional signal that marks progress towards something we deem valuable. And then comes the second conclusion. The higher the goal, the deeper and richer the sense of fulfillment we experience while moving toward it. Out of this logic arises the ultimate question. What then is the highest goal? Why not aim for that, rather than something small or fleeting? The answer takes shape in the phrase, "Do your best for the best." But some may object, saying, this is only a clever way of chasing happiness. But happiness in the narrow hedonistic sense can be bought for a moment. A drug like cocaine will flood the system, lighting it up with pleasure. But what about tomorrow? What about next week, next month, or even 10 years down the road? Hedonism, as a guiding principle, collapses in the face of suffering. When hardship strikes, pleasure evaporates. Even without suffering, if life is lived only in pursuit of today's fleeting delights, tomorrow's self is neglected. The self that exists across time, the one who must live tomorrow, next year, or even decades later, will inherit only ruin. The person who serves only immediate pleasure ends as a hollow shell, a burned-out wreck 10 years down the line. Therefore, a deeper truth emerges. If you fail to see yourself as a community stretched across time, you are not even serving yourself. But if you recognize that your life is a chain linking your present, your future, and even the lives of others, then serving yourself and serving others become one and the same. Not long ago, I devoted an entire course to the Sermon on the Mount. In one striking passage, Christ says, "You are the salt of the earth. Do not lose your saltiness." At first, many interpret this as a reference to reliability, to being the steady, dependable ones who bear the weight of the world. Salt, after all, preserves food. But as I studied, compared translations, and spoke with scholars, I discovered that the phrase carries a deeper meaning. Salt does not only preserve, it flavors, it spices. To lose your saltiness is to become flat, predictable, lifeless. To retain saltiness is to remain unpredictable, dynamic, infused with energy and spirit. There must be spice in the system, a touch of unpredictability, a spark of humor, a playfulness that prevents the soul from turning into a lifeless copy of the past bound only by rigid rules. There should be some snake coiled within the tree, some fire within the bush. These are symbolic ways of expressing the same truth. Within each of us, there must remain a living dynamism. This dynamism is often tied to enthusiasm, and enthusiasm itself carries divine roots. The word literally means to be imbued with the Spirit of God. That is why people are drawn to comedians. They breathe spirit and vitality into the world through humor. Even the most serious duties must be carried with a light touch, for humor keeps the law from turning into lifeless rigidity. I saw this lived out during a journey to Newfoundland, where I worked on a documentary. Newfoundland is a land of rock and harsh winds, beautiful but unforgiving. The people there had to become tough, resilient, and sturdy to survive. But what stood out most was their humor. They never stopped making fun, never lost the ability to laugh even amidst hardship. This humor was not a distraction, it was a lifeline. It allowed them to carry heavy burdens without being crushed. It gave them the ability to speak of serious matters with a lightness that prevented despair. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of circumstances, the spark of play and laughter could keep the soul alive. And this is something I have been trying to learn more deeply myself, to bring that light touch even into the gravest conversations. For mastery does not lie only in solemn wisdom, but also in the ability to balance severity with laughter. In the depths of genuine suffering, people look desperately for a lifeline. For an infant, the lifeline must be compassion, an overwhelming flood of gentleness and care. That is the proper response to a being so fragile and dependent.
But for someone moving toward adulthood, or striving to bear the responsibilities of maturity, the lifeline may need to take another form. Compassion remains vital, but it must often be paired with something else, something that not only soothes but strengthens, something that does not only comfort but prepares the soul to endure and to rise.
There is always something within us that can rise above what we are today, something much more, perhaps even enough to withstand suffering so it does not consume us or drag everything into hell along with it. That, in fact, is the most optimistic truth of all, that within us lies the potential to endure, to transform, and to prevail. As one reflection put it, it is true that character is to some extent innate. We are each dealt a particular hand, with talents and temptations built into our nature. But just as true, perhaps even more true, is that character is shaped by choices. Choices made deliberately, with the knowledge that they are part of our responsibility toward a purpose greater than selfish aims. This purpose extends outward, to family, to friends, to community, even to country. Such responsibility, far from being mere duty for duty's sake, becomes, in moments of despair, a lifeline. As many have found in their darkest hours, the surest antidote to nihilism and misery is not to retreat further into oneself, but to step outside and serve. To ease the burden of another is, paradoxically, the best possible thing one can do for oneself. And so, when crisis strikes, the question is not merely what we must endure, but who we will become in the face of it. It is here that the ancient story of the dragon reemerges. Someone raises the alarm, "There is a dragon," and declares themselves the one to confront it. The cry echoes today in modern forms, such as the warnings of environmental catastrophe. And the natural question follows, is this dragon real or imagined? Every time such a claim arises, a sober assessment must be made. Perhaps the apocalypse looms, perhaps it does not. The truth is rarely simple. Oceans have been overfished, ecosystems have been damaged, there are looming problems, no doubt. Whether climate change stands alone as the ultimate dragon is another matter entirely. But the issue is not only the dragon's existence, it is also the manner of those who claim the right to slay it. If the would-be dragon slayer is paralyzed by fear, if their panic spreads as paralysis to others, then perhaps they are not the leader we need. If on top of fear they resort to tyranny, compelling others by force to act on their behalf, then they become not liberators, but terrified tyrants. History shows us that such leaders cannot guide people out of crisis. They lack the calm, the vision, and the steadiness required of a Moses leading his people through the wilderness. Contrast this with voices like Bjorn Lomborg, Matt Ridley, or Marian Tupy. They do not deny the existence of problems, but they frame them differently, as challenges that humanity has the capacity to solve. The track record of human history, they remind us, is one of learning faster and more efficiently, finding ways to do more with less. This perspective is not careless optimism, but grounded trust in the human spirit. And it forces us to reconsider what we even mean by the environment. For if the environment is simply everything, then to say, "I am worried about the environment," is indistinguishable from saying, "I am worried about everything." Such vague proclamations inspire fear, but not action.
What is needed instead are clear eyes, steady hands, and the faith that humanity, if led wisely, can indeed rise to the challenge of its dragons. But if dragons test leaders, then another force has shaped us just as powerfully: the choices of women. Unlike female chimpanzees who mate indiscriminately with any male in heat, human females are choosy. They select. And in doing so, they have profoundly shaped the destiny of our species. How do they choose? They look to the hierarchy. Not merely to brute power, though brutes exist, but to something deeper: influence, leadership, the kind of man other men themselves have elevated. Over millions of years, this process of female choice intertwined with male competition has forged the very architecture of who we are. Consider it, for at least 6 million years since our split from chimpanzees, the male dominance hierarchy has acted as a vast testing ground. Men who could ascend its rungs were more likely to pass on their genes. But ascent was never random. It required certain qualities: courage, resilience, competence, sometimes strength, often cunning, but above all, the ability to lead and inspire. And all the while, women were watching, selecting, reinforcing the pattern. This has given rise to something astonishing. Human beings are not only adapted to hierarchies, we are adapted to the very act of climbing them. That climb, that striving for the top, is the spirit of the individual itself. The eye atop the pyramid, forever scanning, striving, ascending. And because we are creatures who watch, we began telling stories about those who climbed highest. The heroes, the ones who could not only rule the hierarchy, but slay the serpent, kill the dragon, seize the treasure, and return it to their people. These were not just tales of strength, they were tales of salvation. The hero kills the beast, secures the gold, rescues the virgin. He does what others cannot, and so he becomes both leader and ideal. Over millennia, such stories refined our very categories of morality. Those who climbed well, who acted nobly, became admirable. Those who climbed by corruption, deceit, or tyranny became dishonorable. Out of this distinction, the categories of good and evil began to form. But humanity did not stop there. From the countless stories of admirable figures, we abstracted further, asking, what is the ideal human? What would it mean to be meta-admirable, the hero of heroes? Over centuries, this question gave birth to religious figures, messianic archetypes, saviors. In the West, the answer crystallized with particular clarity. The ideal person is the one who tells the truth. Why? Because truth-telling proves to be the single most stable, lasting way of climbing hierarchies across all domains. Lies may offer short-term gain, but they corrupt trust, erode stability, and topple the climber in time. Truth, as difficult as it is, endures. It builds hierarchies that last. This insight shaped Western culture, the belief that success and well-being are maximized not by power alone, but by honest striving in a domain suited to one's abilities. The wisdom follows naturally. Find a field where your intelligence places you in the upper quartile, not so low that you are crushed, not so high that you stagnate. Do not be the dullest in the room, for that brings despair. But do not be the very brightest either, for that may mean that you are in the wrong room. Instead, find the pond where you can grow, strive, and climb honestly.
Imagine standing at the very peak of a mountain. You've climbed so far, mastered so much, and now the world below lies at your feet. Yet, paradoxically, this is the very moment when the climb must begin again, somewhere new, somewhere steeper, where you're once more at the base. For mastery, by its very nature, demands a constant ascent. Not everyone is wired to spend 70 or 80 hours a week scaling those heights. Some crave leisure, the open afternoons, the chance to rest and breathe. There's nothing wrong with that. Some lives are better lived with more air and less pressure. But there are others, people who cannot bear the weight of idleness. For them, stillness feels like suffocation.
These souls are suited for the steepest climbs, the endless challenges, the 75-hour weeks. And yet, at the top of these hierarchies, those cowering pyramids of complexity, life is no gentle stroll. To rise there requires not just intelligence, but a rare kind, intelligence that operates like speed. Everything at that level is a race, and the fastest minds arrive first. But speed alone isn't enough. It takes insane levels of conscientiousness, the ability to endure sharp shocks of stress, and the capacity to decide with terrifying swiftness in moments where the horizon is only seconds wide. This is why the truly great often have minds soaring above 145, sometimes pushing toward 160. They are the rare ones, 1 in 10,000, even 1 in 100,000, capable of meeting such demands. They endure the chaos of sharp fluctuations, the jagged stress, and yet they climb. But here's the truth. Success is not simply about standing at the summit alone. Too often we mistake it for competition, for being faster, smarter, or richer than those beside us. That is a shallow reading of the story. The deepest joy of success lies not in conquering, but in lifting. The best professors, the greatest entrepreneurs, the leaders who truly matter, what thrills them most is not their own status, but the spark they see in others. They delight in finding promise in the young, in opening doors, in mentoring with generosity. There is a radical satisfaction in helping someone else rise. This is the part of capitalism too often overlooked. For all its critics and cynics, it contains within it an undeniable beauty, the opportunity to create success that multiplies. True entrepreneurs and good leaders know this. They build not just businesses, but people. To succeed without helping others succeed is hollow. To climb while pushing others down is no ascent at all, but a kind of torture. Because deep within us, woven into the fabric of our being, is reciprocity. Humans are profoundly social, bound to one another at an ancient primal level. When we betray that, when we work against it, bitterness and malevolence fester. But when we honor it, when we live in service to our families, our communities, our fellow travelers, there are few joys that can compare.
This is why material success on its own so often disappoints. Money, possessions, trophies, they glimmer, but only for a moment. They are fleeting, unable to provide the depth and permanence that comes from service, mentoring, and the relationships built along the way. There is no true success without moral success. To win without integrity, to rise without goodness, is not victory at all. It is torment. For deep down, you cannot escape your own judgment. You know when you are not good, when you have not earned what you hold, and no amount of material wealth can silence that knowledge. And let's imagine for a moment that a person's conscience is right, that their judgment of themselves is fair, and not merely the product of harsh self-criticism. If such a person lives without success, then at least they are spared the constant torment of injustice. They may think, I am flawed, but I have nothing to show for it. And perhaps that is fitting.
But what if the opposite occurs? What if someone rises to wealth and power, yet knows deep down that their triumph is ill-gotten? Then every treasure they acquire becomes a curse. Every step up the ladder is accompanied not by joy, but by the bitter taste of guilt. Their possessions transform into monuments of corruption, each one whispering that their success was born of betrayal, exploitation, or cruelty. To live like that is to exist in torment, forever rationalizing, forever haunted by the truth that their rise came at the cost of others. No amount of material wealth can cleanse a stained conscience. What people truly long for is not only success, but a clean soul. They want honesty in their dealings, dependability in their character, trustworthiness in their relationships. And if on top of that they can live with adventure, excitement, and courage, so much the better. But success without goodness is not success at all. It is a slow form of self-destruction. In truth, one's only real measure is against oneself. Especially with age, life becomes so unique and idiosyncratic that comparison with others loses meaning. Of course, one must care about the views of others. Human beings are social creatures and cannot ignore society, but no one else has precisely your burdens, your opportunities, your peculiar mix of talents and limitations. Any attempt to compare lives will always fall short because you cannot see the full cost others pay for their victories. Many who appear rich beyond imagination carry invisible weights. Their grand houses, their material abundance, these cannot shield them from the fundamental struggles of human existence. The rich, too, face illness, loneliness, betrayal, and death. And often the price of wealth has been decades of relentless sacrifice, 80-hour weeks that left marriages broken, children estranged, health corroded. Yes, they are wealthy, but they are also old, and wealth cannot buy youth. So the question arises, would you rather be young and poor or old and rich? Most would choose youth, because time, once lost, cannot be purchased at any price. And this is why envy is foolish. You never know the hidden burdens behind another person's life. You cannot see the sacrifices, the wounds, the sleepless nights that made their success possible. So to envy is to imagine only the gold, never the cost of facing the dragon that guarded it.
Some even chase power itself, believing it to be the highest prize. But power alone is a fragile foundation. Authority gained without reciprocity, without mutual respect, collapses quickly. Tyrannies always rot from within, for they sever their bond with the people they claim to serve. Even in the modern world, power pursued for its own sake leads organizations, empires, and individuals alike to ruin. Consider the corporate elite, the lawyers and executives in the shining towers of New York, earning $700 an hour, but chained endlessly to their work. Their lives are consumed by endless contracts, meetings, and deadlines. For some, such labor is bearable, even natural. They are built for it, driven by an inner engine of hyper-conscientiousness that never lets them rest. But for many others, such a life is suffocating, a gilded cage of exhaustion. Conscientiousness itself is a strange gift. It predicts long-term success better than almost any other trait. Yet it also carries a shadow. Those who are too conscientious often tear themselves apart. Conscientiousness, like a double-edged sword, shapes both the hero and the martyr. Those who possess it feel the weight of every choice, every responsibility, every failure. They rise higher than most, but the climb is steep and the air thin. Sleep comes fitfully, if at all, and leisure feels like a betrayal. Yet in this exact tension, they discover a strange, relentless beauty, the forging of character. For it is through struggle, through discipline, through the conscious wrestling with life's chaos, that the individual becomes capable of something extraordinary. And that is the essence of heroism, not the power itself, not the wealth or status, but the moral courage to act rightly within the hierarchy of life, to lift oneself while lifting others, to master both the outer world and the inner tempest, to climb, yes, but to climb in a way that preserves the integrity of your soul. Because without that integrity, all triumphs are hollow. You may sit at the top of the pyramid, a king in name, but your kingdom is built on shifting sand. The dragons you slay, the obstacles, the rivals, the chaos of life must be faced not only with strength and intelligence, but with fairness, empathy, and wisdom. Only then can the gold you bring back to the community taste sweet. Only then can the stories told of you be worthy of admiration.
And here is the irony of life. Those who are most capable of ascending the hierarchy, who have the intellect, the strength, the endurance, the focus, are often also those most tempted to lose themselves along the way. Power can seduce. Conscientiousness can imprison. Success can corrupt if it is divorced from the ethical compass that guides action. The hero, then, is defined as much by the restraint they exercise as by the heights they reach. The dragon must be confronted, yes, but without becoming the dragon oneself. So as one watches the landscape of human striving, the patterns become clear. The stories we tell of heroes, the myths of dragons and virgins, of treasure and glory, are not merely fanciful tales. They are encoded wisdom from millions of years of evolution, a record of what kinds of character, what strategies, what virtues allowed humans to survive, to thrive, and to pass on their genes. Female choice in mate selection, the subtle pressures of dominance hierarchies, the social bonds that stabilize power, all of these are the loom on which the fabric of human morality and mythology is woven.
And when we read these stories, when we see the hero triumph, it is not simply entertainment, it is guidance. It whispers the principles of what it means to climb, to endure, to prevail, and to be worthy of the treasure we may claim, not only the gold, but the respect, the love, the life fully lived, the conscience intact. So here we stand, modern humans, heir to 6 million years of hierarchical trials, social challenges, and heroic exemplars. The dragons of our age may be subtler: stress, uncertainty, competition, moral dilemmas, but they are no less real. And within each of us lies the same capacity as the first hunter, the first strategist, the first climber of the social ladder, the capacity to meet challenge with courage, to climb with integrity, to triumph without sacrificing the soul. The question is, will we rise? Sometimes life throws situations at you that are completely outside of your control. Imagine working hard for years and then suddenly being laid off. People who are highly conscientious often tear themselves apart with guilt in those situations because they carry such a heavy sense of responsibility for everything that happens to them. But that same conscientiousness, which is a strength, also makes you vulnerable. It can even make you difficult to live with because you may find yourself working all the time, consumed with providing and producing while neglecting other parts of life. There's an imbalance there. Someone can be morally good, honest, and hardworking, yet in a materialistic society be labeled a failure simply because they haven't accumulated much wealth. That points to a deeper issue. It's a problem of measurement. Our culture tends to measure worth and success through economic outcomes, and those are usually correlated with intelligence and conscientiousness. To a certain extent, this correlation makes sense because if you want to be a successful business person across multiple ventures, you need to be honest. Dishonesty might work for a while, but it will eventually catch up with you. It's extremely difficult to maintain success through deceit across different domains without being exposed. So there is at least some association between success and moral virtue, but it's only a rough approximation because plenty of exceptions exist. Creative people, for example, often struggle to monetize their contributions no matter how valuable those contributions may be. The same problem applies to homemakers. Why don't we pay homemakers despite the fact that they do incredibly important work? It's because what they produce isn't monetizable for 20 years, and our economic system isn't sophisticated enough to account for value that's delayed that far into the future. A venture capitalist expects a tenfold return within a handful of years. No one invests on a 20-year horizon when it comes to household labor, even though the benefits are obvious and profound. That's why homemakers are unfairly caught in a system that undervalues them. It's a flaw in our method of measurement, not because the work lacks value, but because our systems can't calculate or distribute that value properly. Until we find a better way, we remain stuck with this limitation. Now think about the question, what is the meaning of life? It's not the best way to ask the question because it assumes that life itself has one singular meaning. It might be better to ask, Where do people find meaning in their lives? The answer is varied, but we can outline some essential categories. People need a career or a job, not only because they must provide food, shelter, and safety to survive, but also because work is a way of serving others and contributing to the community. Work is not merely a product of capitalism, it arises from the basic human need to fight hunger and cold. You could argue about which system organizes this best, but the necessity itself exists beyond political or economic systems. Beyond work, people need education to stretch their intelligence to its limits. They need intimate relationships and family. They need friends. They need to care for their mental and physical health. They need to manage temptations so they don't fall into destructive habits. And they need a higher pursuit, whether spiritual, philosophical, or transcendent, that helps orient them towards something beyond the immediate. These roles, while socially reinforced, are also deeply human. If you strip them away, you're left with emptiness. To find meaning, you must engage in them. Nothing is a good place. It's not freedom. It's foolish to think that freedom is just the ability to choose between jobs or even whether or not you have a job. When I was younger, around 10 or 12, I used to think that being an adult meant doing whatever you want. It was only when I got older that I realized being an adult actually means having responsibility. A sign of maturity isn't doing whatever you feel like. It's having obligations and responsibilities toward other people. You just made a case for identity as social responsibility and duty. That's very different from identity as a felt sense. It's just not helpful to have your identity be your feelings because it doesn't give you anything. You pointed out that for you, there's some fulfillment in performing your roles properly. You have a number of activities or games that you chose to some degree voluntarily, but that are also socially structured. You find satisfaction and freedom from anxiety in carrying out those roles properly. That is what people are like. Demolishing or criticizing those roles as purely oppressive is not helpful because it leaves nothing, and having nothing is a terrible state for people to be in. You are very fortunate if you are constrained by a number of functional roles. That is what everybody needs. Some people need less structure than others, especially if they are highly open in personality, fundamentally creative, and low in conscientiousness. They don't like order and don't need much of it. For them, even a little structure goes a long way. But highly functional people who are spontaneously creative face real difficulty making their way in the world. Monetizing creativity is extraordinarily difficult. Some manage it exceptionally well. They're geniuses. But even then, they are rarely economically successful. Belief is what you stake your actions on. There is choice in it too, and that is faith. Faith isn't about deciding to believe things that are preposterous, though there is confusion about that in both religious and non-religious communities. For example, you can decide that it's better to tell the truth than to lie. That is a decision because your action is not based on predicting the outcome. You've decided to look at things in a certain way. You can decide to do your best to say what you believe to be true because you have faith that there is no better way forward than the truth, no matter what it looks like. The decision of faith is necessary because it gives you a particular perspective on evidence. Maybe you say something you believe to be true and get in trouble. You might think that this means speaking the truth was wrong, but not necessarily. Saying what you believe to be true may have been the right thing to do, even if the immediate outcome was negative. You have to make decisions about how you interpret facts. Those are decisions of faith. Then you decide what you have faith in. For instance, you might want to have faith that existence is worthwhile and that we should all work for its benefit. You might question if that is true, because there's a lot of suffering in life, especially associated with consciousness. You could argue that the suffering makes the whole game suspect, and that's a valid claim. But it's not a claim you want to live by. Instead, you try to live out the alternative claim that, all things considered, working for existence in its benefit is better. You could also justify altering falsehoods, but choosing faith is about what you decide is worth acting on.
If it's expedient, that's why people lie. And people do lie. Obviously, they believe what they are doing to some degree, otherwise they wouldn't lie. But you can decide that you will not do that, because it's wrong. That is not just an observation, it's a proposition. I am going to live my life as if lying is wrong. I have derived both of these principles, the wish for the furtherance of being and the idea that truth is redemptive. These are fundamental Judeo-Christian propositions, perhaps the most fundamental ones.
They seem valid enough to stake my life on. That is the decision of faith. What are you going to stake your life on? This faith is manifested in action, not in your claims about the explicit contents of your descriptions of the world. This ideal is embedded in our structure. You could say it's the internalization of a social ideal, but it's more than that. It's probably the internalization of a biological ideal, but even more than that. Why did this biological ideal manifest rather than some other ideal? These are questions I am exploring while writing my next book. A rough outline is that men, historically, gathered in groups to accomplish significant tasks. They voted among themselves, so to speak, on who to elevate to positions of status and authority. Men would continually decide who to carry on their shoulders, cheering them out of the stadium, and women would select from the top of that. This is our evolutionary history, sexual selection. We are participating in the joint creation of an ideal negotiated between the sexes. I think that is undeniable. Biologically, one fascinating aspect of Exodus is that when God tells the Pharaoh to free the Israelites, he always uses the same phrase, but only half of it is commonly heard: "Let my people go." You rarely hear the second half, which is repeated 9 or 10 times, one for each plague, perhaps 10 if you count the devastation of the firstborn. The full phrase is, "Let my people go that they may serve me in the wilderness." Miss Prager pointed out that the word freedom isn't used once in the Exodus narrative. Freedom from tyranny is not hedonism. It's not the blind pursuit of passions. True freedom is servitude to a higher purpose, voluntarily accepted. Perhaps the highest purpose, which is what God calls the Israelites to. Purpose is meaning. That's a profound idea, especially if you find purpose in duty, responsibility, and sacrifice, which you genuinely do. Purpose is deeply connected to meaning, and meaning is happiness. We often do not think about happiness properly. Happiness is neither joy nor mere entertainment. It is an ontological condition, fundamental to our existence as humans. When the founders drafted the Declaration of Independence, they listed 3 rights we are entitled to: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Your purpose may be great in the eyes of the world, or it may seem small and commonplace. Your purpose might be your family or your children, tutoring a child and changing their life, starting a business, cleaning up your block, helping others, or setting an example. As John Adams said, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. All of this ties together: faith, duty, purpose, and true freedom. Happiness is found in the pursuit of meaning and purpose, and that is closely tied to duty and responsibility to others. I think that is fundamentally true, and I believe it is the way out of the deepest suffering. You want to be someone who can take a joke, and you want to be productive. The best definition I ever read of Christian charity, or charity in general, is generosity plus productivity. People often emphasize the first part, especially when they lack the second. I'm generous, they say, but they have nothing to give. I'm not talking about people who truly have nothing and still share. I'm talking about those who diminish productivity while praising their own generosity, forgetting that being productive actually makes generosity more effective. Some socialists claim that Jesus was a socialist, which is a common refrain from the progressive left. The idea is that you should give to others, but Jesus wasn't saying you should take from others to make them give charity. He was saying you need to be generous with your own belongings, your time, and your labor. A generosity of the heart, not a demand on others. This is an injunction toward the highest form of self-sacrifice. That self-sacrifice is required even if you are innocent. You also need the ability to delay gratification, which ties into the idea of treating yourself as a community across time. Delaying gratification means sacrificing present pleasures for the security and stability of the future. This is a hallmark of maturity and ties directly to making sacrifices. That is why the sacrificial motif is stressed in the Old Testament. You make sacrifices to whatever you value. The highest value is God, so if you sacrifice to God. If you don't sacrifice, you are immature. If you sacrifice to a lesser value, you need to reassess your priorities. This is why God tells Adam and Eve they are condemned to work after leaving the Garden of Eden. Work is a form of sacrifice. The question becomes, in service of what? In another chapter of the book, titled Do Something Hard, it is stated very directly, we live in a society that tries to remove all suffering as if a utopia is possible, but that is a false promise.
It prevents the necessary sacrifice and uphill struggle because people are made to feel that having to work harder than others is an injustice. Yet all of us must work hard in some areas to improve and achieve. Some people face multiple, almost incomprehensible difficulties, but even for the rest of us, effort and struggle are part of life. Difficulty is intrinsically bound up with reward. We cheer for others who overcome immense odds because we recognize that struggle is part of achieving something of value. If you are uncertain about your path, set yourself the obligation to choose a more difficult challenge before changing course. This prevents laziness, inertia, envy, and resentment. By taking on a bigger challenge, you can have faith in your choice because you faced something harder rather than quitting. Alfred North Whitehead said the reason we think is so we can let our thoughts die instead of us dying. Imagine you have 50 bad ideas in a day. If you act impulsively on them, you could get hurt or worse. A better alternative is to test those ideas in dialogue with others, expose them to scrutiny before acting. This way, you avoid harm. Thoughts are not just representations of the world. Fundamentally, a thought is a potential action. In your imagination, you create avatars of yourself to simulate actions safely, allowing you to learn, evaluate, and discard ideas without catastrophic consequences. When you imagine an action, what if I did this? You create a little avatar of yourself in your imagination. You play out scenarios. If I act like this, these good things happen. That is your vision. Then you present your vision to others. Here's what I see. They might say, that's a stupid vision. You didn't account for X, Y, Z. At first, that stings because you are attached to your vision. But their critique is valuable. It helps you see the obstacles you didn't anticipate. Sometimes people attack your vision because they don't have one themselves, not because your vision is wrong. For example, I once spoke to a kid who wanted 1 million followers on social media. I told him, realistically, that probably won't happen for you, based on my experience. He freaked out. His dream was shattered. Dreams are like tiles of the future. They cover the unknown with a pleasing image. But sometimes the dream is low resolution, and feedback helps refine it. People imagine vast rewards, like $400 million, but can they handle the responsibility? Would they distribute it wisely, protect it from parasites, or manage the consequences? These questions matter, because fortune without preparation can be destructive. A mythological example illustrates this: The Lion King. It is a brilliant narrative because it captures universal truths. The phrase, "the light touches our kingdom," is more than poetic. It represents consciousness and understanding. Shining light on something allows you to establish a relationship with it, to explore and understand it. The kingdom, then, is everything illuminated by your consciousness. Outside the light is the unknown, the kingdom of darkness, where danger and chaos exist. This mirrors real life. Moving beyond the known is entering the unknown, the underworld of challenges. In the story, Simba's father, Mufasa, represents wisdom, strength, and the positive aspect of leadership. Scar, the evil brother, represents resentment, pride, and intellectual cunning. Mythologically, the king always has an evil brother, a counterpart representing the potential for corruption, willful blindness, and the abuse of power. Psychologically, every person and institution contains some evil uncle within their structure. Recognizing that duality is essential to navigating life responsibly. Humility is the antidote to pride, which blocks learning. Humility allows you to remain open like a child, always observing, questioning, and absorbing new information. Children are constantly exploring the unknown without assuming they already know everything. Pride stops learning, while humility opens the door to growth, understanding, and the ability to refine your vision in the light of reality.